Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Discussing this novel are Professor Alfred Marks and Professor Joseph Satterwhite.
One may give a prefatory note to this discussion of prose and make it a note of warning that this discussion presupposes a careful reading of the novel on the part of the student. Now, the novel begins with the paragraph, "The Nelly, a cruising yawl, swung to her anchor without a flutter of the sails and was at rest. The flood had made, the wind was nearly calm, and being bound down the river, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide." And so ensues, for 5 or 10 pages, the scene of the Nelly waiting here for the tide to turn, and in the interval before it can start downstream, these old seafaring friends sit together smoking cigars and hear this latest story that will be the principal content of the novel. Now, what is the purpose of this rather prolix story frame? Why does Conrad use this technique that is apt to frighten away the more timid reader? Why does he employ this? What purpose does it serve, Dr. Satterwhite?
Well, there are probably a good many services that the narrative frame performs or renders. One that occurs to me first is that Marlowe, as readers of Conrad know, is a remarkable storyteller. He'll tell a story at the drop of a hat or at the slightest hint of stimulation or interest on the part of his readers. And one of the first things you notice is that the seascape, or the physical environment, suggests to Marlowe an experience, a very meaningful experience that he underwent sometime previous. The river, the Thames, reminds Marlowe of the African river, which he ascended in a rickety steamboat. And moreover, the darkening gloom that comes with the sunset gives a rather sinister aspect to what has otherwise been a familiar and a romantic scene, and suggests to Marlowe some of the sinister aspects, the evil aspects that nature has for the mature mind.
Then there is a definite relationship between the frame and the picture, as it were, just as one chooses a frame carefully for a picture, and, if possible, the artist very often constructs his own frame for his picture. Here we have a construction of the frame that is going to be used on the picture of the Heart of Darkness, and there is a relationship, a close relationship between the two.
Oh, yes, indeed. I would agree. Marlowe has the historical sense. As he lies there on the afterdeck of the Nelly, replete with a good dinner, the cigars and the brandy have been consumed, he remembers that Roman adventurers, much like Kurtz, and much like the Europeans who explored the Heart of Darkness in Africa, that Roman explorers probably came up the Thames and were probably assaulted by the same primitive terrors, probably fell victim to the same human depravities that later are to destroy Kurtz. This parallel, I think, reminds Marlowe of the story which he subsequently tells. And we're prepared, I think, in his discussion of the Roman invaders of Britain, we're prepared for his discussion of Kurtz, who was a 19th century invader of Africa.
He has the same reason, then, for bringing in, after a few paragraphs, Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Franklin, knights all, titled and untitled, whose ships the Thames had borne, ships like the Golden Hind and the Erebus and the Terror. All of these had come up here. And then when he talks then about hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, They had all gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. He is again alluding to part of what is going to come out in connection with Kurtz.
Yes, these are all variations on the central theme which the story of Kurtz dramatizes for us. All of these people are people who have left the civilized, conventional world where outward pressures tend to prevent any primitive outbursts, and they've all taken the great risk of going into primitive lands where the sense of duty and where the police and where one's consideration for the opinion of others tend to disappear, and one is left with oneself.
Then what does Marlowe mean by this statement, which takes up a whole paragraph? And this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places on the earth.
Well, I think he means, among other things, that in the time of the Roman invasion, that Britain, the island of Britain, was as primitive as Africa was in the late 19th century. That it was a country, and I quote a later character in the story, it was a country where one might do anything. The later speaker is speaking of Africa. It's a locale which, in a curious way, drives a man in upon himself. It denudes him of all the exterior forces that direct him to right and moral action. It leaves him upon his own moral resources.
Then along the same line, after about 2 paragraphs, he begins the paragraph by saying, I was thinking of very old times when the Romans first came here, 1900 years ago the other day. Light came out of this river since. You say nights? Yes, but it is like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday. Now, I think I recall discussing with you one day the fact that Conrad and Ford Madox Ford, or Ford Madox Hoofer, had discussed the fact that when people talk to each other, they don't necessarily carry out a very carefully coherent question and answer series, that sometimes they jump from one topic to another, and sometimes one person seems to be guilty of having thought about the last thing that he'd said while the other man was actually advancing the topic. So we do have, perhaps exemplified here, this tendency for Conrad to jump around and to move around quite awkwardly within a paragraph. Now, what does he mean here by this light came out of this river since, in connection with the River Thames, since the Romans had come here?
Well, I'll hazard a guess that that after the civilizing processes had converted Britain from a pagan land into a highly developed, highly civilized country, that in their turn the English became explorers and became colonizers, became extenders of light. I suspect that Conrad refers to the light of civilization. He was a great admirer of highly civilized communities which erected artificial codes for behavior so that men would not be thrown in upon their own meager moral resources.
But then he says, yes, but it is like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in the flicker. What does he think then about the impermanence of civilization?
Well, those who read Conrad closely, and I'd like to think I am one, are convinced that Conrad felt himself the historian of a crumbling civilization, a world in which morality, in which honor, in which devotion to duty, in which personal codes of morality were all breaking up for some reason or other. I find him a very pessimistic writer, and I think this is one of the sources of his pessimism. He was watching, for example, the breakup of the British Empire, which we are now witnessing the last phases of. And I think it refers to these alternating periods of high moral integrity followed by primitivism, which the history of the world seems to describe.
I'd like to jump back now into two paragraphs before the one that we were talking in, to a statement at the end of the paragraph that I think might be quite meaningful in connection with Conrad's storytelling technique. It's a sentence that begins, that is the last sentence of the paragraph that I mentioned, begins, "But Marlowe was not typical, if his propensity to spin yarns be accepted." And here is the important line, "And to him the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze." What does this show us about Conrad's storytelling technique?
Frankly, I find this metaphor somewhat baffling. I believe I'll return the question to you, Al.
The notion that I have here is, I wanted it back anyway. The notion that I have here is that the important part of the story to Conrad is not the center, but is the outside. That all the time you are moving into the center, you have the central meaning with you all the time. Now, that means that it's not like the story, let us say, or a story that would exemplify the germ theory of Henry James, in which you move closer and closer in toward the germ and toward the germinal meaning, and that once you find this particular central meaning, the whole story becomes clear in a flash of insight. You come into the story, let us say, as in Henry James, the pupil, and move into the story and suddenly find in it that the boy, the pupil in it, has discovered that his people are really quite dishonest in money matters. And when you make this discovery that the child actually thinks this and actually realizes this, then you have the center of the story, and this controls the rest for James. Now, Conrad is saying here that actually you have the central meaning all the time you're working, and that you may think that you're moving closer to the heart of the story, that you'll find more meaning in the heart than you do outside, and I'm using advisedly his central imagery of the heart of darkness, but actually you do have the meaning all the time, even on the outside of the kernel. Now, we move on 2 or 3 paragraphs to the statement that, to the paragraph that begins, "Mind, he began again." And then we come to the statement that he makes on the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. Now, the first part of it, of course, we can understand. It's not a pretty thing. But what does he mean by saying that there is something redeeming about it, that the idea is redeeming?
Well, I think, again, this is a hint as to what the story is going to be about. Later, we find the central character of the story, Kurtz, as a man who's gone into Africa with what Conrad would call a sentimental idea. His intent is to civilize the natives. But I think Conrad is talking about something altogether different here. It's impossible to through sentiment or through idealism to conceal the fact that economic exploitation is a nasty thing. The only thing that gives it meaning, as I read Conrad, is one's devotion to the work itself. That economic conquest, political or military conquest, is an ugly thing, and what glorifies it, what gives it meaning, is the degree of dedication which those who carry out the conquest can devote to it. I don't believe this is a subtle idea. I think it's quite clear in Conrad. Would you agree, sir?
So then, even though it is a bad cause, the fact that it is a cause of some kind in a way redeems it, or at least it is a cause that people will fight selflessly for.
Yes, this is the way I read Conrad. I don't think this is sophistic. It seems to me you've given Conrad's idea a pejorative slant that it perhaps does not have. It seems to me Conrad argues rather persuasively for salvation through devotion. And if one must devote oneself to an unrighteous cause, that's bad. Nevertheless, the devotion is the important thing. Is this, do you agree, sir? I mean, is this too badly out of line?
Yes, I think that I can agree with this entirely. The next paragraph, then, ends with these words. I suppose you fellows remember I did once turn freshwater sailor for a bit. And with these words, says Conrad, we knew we were fated, before the ebb began to run, to hear about one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences. It looks then as if Conrad does understand that these frames of his are rather prolix, and that they are apt to drive away the timid reader, or the reader who is easily bored.
Well, perhaps. I find it interesting that Conrad can diagnose the illness of his own fiction. It's interesting to note that Marlowe's auditors are also impatient. Their minds tend to wander, and Marlowe must constantly reassure them that if the story he's telling seems incomprehensible, that he doesn't understand it very well himself. This may be, as you so well pointed out, a piece of romantic irony. I don't know. Tastes change. This leisurely introduction perhaps might prove irritating and discouraging to a modern reader. On the other hand, a late 19th century reader might take a great deal of pleasure in this leisurely, involuted approach.
Yes, I do like to think of it as being an ironic technique, somewhat similar to so-called romantic irony, in which the author apologizes for what he's going to give, although he doesn't really have any reason to apologize for it, or makes fun of what he is giving. Remember how this happens in Don Quixote. Don Quixote is described as having the last name Quixote, or was it Quesada? And then, to make things difficult, Cervantes takes about 3 pages discussing what the last name of this man Quixote might have been. He says, was it Quesada or Quijada or something else? And he talks and talks and talks about it, what it might have been. Then he discusses these tales of chivalry that the Don had read too much of. And then after the Don finishes it, he proceeds to launch into several tales of chivalry along the line in the story. Simply this business of, I suppose the Japanese do this very commonly. They give you a gift and they say to you, well, it's really not very good. It's really not something you want at all, but certainly if you agreed with them by saying that, well, really it's not very good, they would be the most broken-hearted people there are.
Yes, I think this discussion of irony is very useful. I sometimes suspect that modern students of literature are not as sensitive to irony as a mode of expression as they might be. Another irony impresses me, the irony of great ironic writing being misunderstood, and the irony not recognized. So I think it's well worthwhile that we point this out.
Well, irony is difficult. It requires a double vision. Irony consists where we have the distortion of a context, and the reader can see both the distortion and the context as it is undistorted. It therefore takes a fairly advanced reader who can be able to look at both views at the same time.
I don't think we ought to obscure the fact, though, that when the speaker characterizes the story as one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences, that he is, in a sense, accurately describing it. Not only is Marlowe ironic, but he is also honestly perplexed. It seems to me one of the most winsome things about Marlowe is that he feels that he doesn't quite understand exactly what's happened to him. He's had a momentous experience. He knows that it is meaningful, and he wants to know what it means, and I think sometimes he tells these stories in the hope that some of his listeners may clear up some of the more obscure and ambiguous points. He is being ironic, but at the same time he's being truthful because he does not completely understand all that's happened to him. I think this is particularly true in the novel Lord Jim, for example.
In other words, it is actually a conclusive experience, but since it is in the realm of human concerns and human ideals, it can never truly be conclusive.
Yes, that's well put. Though Marlowe does in the next paragraph describe the experience in very interesting terms. He says, "I don't want to bother you much with what happened to me personally, yet to understand the effect of it on me, you ought to hear how I got out there. It was the farthest point of navigation and the culminating point of my experience. It seemed somehow to throw a kind of light on everything about me and into my thoughts. And yet it's not very clear. No, not very clear. And yet it seemed to throw a kind of light." So Marlowe describes it then as the farthest point of his navigation and the culminating point of his experience. This, it seems to me, insists upon the vital nature of whatever experience Marlowe has undergone.
And this brings us to the imagery in the point navigation. Actually, Conrad, there is a kind of allegory lurking underneath all Conrad writing, and navigation here seems to mean that to Conrad every man sets out on a sea journey of kinds.
Yes, I'd agree.
And that the farthest point of navigation is actually the point of greatest understanding about life.
Yes, that's true.
And so perhaps it means that in a way, does it mean here that Marlowe has regressed or retrogressed since this time? Or does it mean that Marlowe has never had an experience of quite this height?
I suspect that the second of the alternate interpretations is the correct one. The long journey has been made. The ultimate point of human navigation has been reached, and Marlowe has returned replete with experience and replete with knowledge. Of course, the sea voyage has for a long time been a respectable symbol of experience and of life. I think in Conrad we can narrow its concept, its symbolic concept, to the search of the journey for self-knowledge, particularly, which, of course, is the only really essential kind of knowledge. What Marlowe means is this, that in the adventure with Kurtz, he has gone as far in the exploration of his own nature as he has yet been able to go. It was the farthest point of navigation.
Now, when you refer to self-nature,
self-knowledge,
or self-knowledge, do you mean that the person learns this all about himself? Is it possible that very often self-knowledge can consist of a knowledge that is outside oneself, about which one learns the importance of its impingement on himself?
Oh yes, that's very well put. I think the usual situation is just as you've described. A particularly sensitive, qualified observer sees something happening to other people and recognizes that he has the potentiality for the act in himself. What Kurtz does, Marlowe recognizes that he is perfectly capable of doing himself. That's what I mean by self-knowledge. I think self-knowledge ordinarily comes from observation rather than from introspection.
Then what you are talking about as self-knowledge here might also be called simply knowledge. But it is a knowledge which the man must recognize is meaningless, save as it has an important effect upon his own personality.
Yes, I'd agree. In Conrad, ordinarily it has importance in that it tells the observer how he himself may act. On the other hand, it has this importance, that it enlightens him as to the probable behavior of others. You frequently find in Conrad a responsible man who has the welfare of a number of men under his command. He's responsible for a ship or for a city. Now, unless he has knowledge of himself, that is, knowledge of human nature, he's very apt to make some serious mistake of judgment which either jeopardizes or destroys those people for whom he's responsible. The most horrendous example I can think of is Lord Jim in the novel Lord Jim, who, through his failure to understand human nature, permits Pirate Brown to sack, burn, and pillage a village.
Well, I think this is very valuable. We don't want to become as prolix as Marlowe in going over these points, in laboring them. I think, however, it is quite valuable for the student, who very often is apt to brush through this first part, quite impatient to get to the story, and as a result misses a good deal that happens here. And I think it also brings up a very important problem in Conrad. What about these long prolix interludes, these long, indefinite conversations, and even these seemingly inconclusive experiences?
Well, without wishing to be defeatist, it seems to me that I must say that for the impatient reader, Conrad will not be very attractive. I think Conrad is a remarkably honest writer. He tries to preserve his own integrity. His writing reflects the incredible complexity of life. Marlowe is a ruminative, reflective, introspective, thoughtful person. And the way he tells his stories reflects and dramatizes the fearful complexity he sees in life.
Then the story begins. Now, when I was a little chap, I had a passion for maps. It starts as many stories do, when I was a young lad before my beard was gray and that kind of thing. Now, when I was a little chap, I had a passion for maps. And he tells how he would look at the map or the globe, but that he wasn't interested in the places that were well populated. He was only interested in the blank spaces. And he told about how the map changed as he grew older, and how much concerned he was about the fact that the map was filling in with names. And he says at the end of the paragraph, but there was one yet, the biggest, the most blank, so to speak, that I had a hankering after. And then he says of it in the next paragraph, it had ceased to be a blank space of delightful mystery, but this is, by the time he was ready to travel, this blank space had become filled with rivers and lakes and names, but he was still curious about it. And then he says it had become a place of darkness. Now, I'm a little bothered by this imagery here. I just don't understand what is the difference between a blank space of delightful mystery and a place of darkness. What does he seem to mean here, Dr. Satterwhite, by this?
Well, among other things, it seems to me he means that what was hitherto completely unknown has now been revealed as a place where the most primitive aspects of human nature are to be observed, not only in the Aborigines themselves, whom we expect to be savage, but in the Europeans who have undertaken the pillage of Africa. And we'll find the story dealing not so much with the savagery of the African natives as with white men who have gone savage in Africa. The darkness, I think, refers to the depths of human depravity which can be observed in Africa.
So the story begins then, and the young man decides that he wants to get help in going to this blank space of delightful mystery. So we see that he goes to speak to people in connection with, or he goes to speak to the members of the company about it. His aunt helps him in going about getting a job with them, and he talks about people being down there engaged in the noble cause, you know, and finally he decides to cross the channel to the heads of the company. He says, "In a very few hours I arrived at a city that always makes me think of a whited sepulchre." Now, I don't know exactly what this city might be. He says, "Prejudice, no doubt. I had no difficulty in finding the company's office." A whited sepulchre, of course, is an urn, is it not? A funeral urn which has a beautiful glaze on it. And it comes from the Bible. I believe it was Christ who called some of the Pharisees whited sepulchres, meaning that they were not people at all. They, in their hypocrisy, were just containers for bones, and at that, dead bones, beautifully whited over to appear pure. So we have then a sense of hypocrisy in connection with the city that he's coming to here, the city that the company's offices are located in, and we have a sense of the of foreboding about the entire trip and about the hypocrisies of the white man's burden in connection with the land that he is going to. He uses in the next paragraph an interesting bit of imagery in connection with the map. He says about the map there that he sees, "There was a vast amount of red, good to see at any time, because one knows that some real work is done in there. A deuce of a lot of blue, a little green, smears of orange, and on the east coast a purple patch to show where the jolly pioneers of progress drink the jolly lager beer." However, I wasn't going into any of these. I was going into the yellow, dead in the center there, and the river was there, fascinating, deadly, like a snake. Do you have any comment on the imagery there, Dr. Satterwhite?
Well, I think you'd probably have to read a good bit of Conrad before you began to become aware of his extreme nationalism. I don't think it's essential to the understanding of the story. Of course, he's talking about a map which is done in national colors. Red is the color of the British Empire. For an adopted citizen, Conrad was certainly a tremendous Anglophile, a great admirer of the British and their assumption of the white man's burden. He had some queer, almost inexplicable hatreds for other people, not the least of which was for the German people. They are the jolly drinkers of the jolly lager beer. He had also a great contempt for, a great loathing for the Russians. Now, whether or not they were colonizers in Africa or not, I don't know. I frankly must confess that any further significance of yellow escapes me.
I think you mentioned one day the loathing that he also had for the Portuguese.
Oh, yes. Great loathing for the Portuguese. It's interesting, in almost all of his books about the Far East, a renegade, a decayed white man, is almost without exception a Portuguese or a half-caste. I think we might mention parenthetically that Conrad suffered, I think, from about the most advanced case of racial intolerance that I know of. He had almost contempt for savagery in any form. And as I said, he was a great practicing Anglophile.
We have some interesting symbolism in this paragraph that we were discussing. The symbolism, however, is not motivated here, but is motivated after a time. We are told that here in the office there are two women, one fat and the other slim, who sat on straw-bottomed chairs knitting black wool. The slim one got up and walked straight at me, still knitting with downcast eyes, and only just as I began to think of getting out of her way, as you would for a somnambulist, stood still and looked up. And then, after 3 paragraphs, they are discussed again. Often far away there I thought of these two, guarding the door of darkness, knitting black wool as for a warm pall, one introducing continuously to the unknown, the other scrutinizing the cheery and foolish faces with unconcerned old eyes. What do you think of the symbolism of these two women here guarding the door of darkness?
Well, I honestly don't know.
I thought on the one hand that the reference might be to the parquet, to the Furies, knitting the shroud and knitting the history of the people who go in and out here. And I also thought of this very important knitter in English literature, Madame Lafarge.
In Dickens?
In Dickens'
Tale of Two Cities?
Tale of Two Cities, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this foreboding about what they're doing. They are rather demented figures here, very busy at their knitting, and one wonders if one's future is not somehow involved with what they do. Also, in their guarding the door of darkness, they become something like Cerberus,
yes, mm-hmm.
the hound of hell here.
The two knitters are interesting. Equally interesting, I think, is the doctor who examines Marlowe. Were you going to say anything about him, Al?
I wish you would.
He suggests to us the course the story may take. He examines Marlowe. It's a perfunctory examination. And then he asks Marlowe if he may measure his head. You must remember, of course, that phrenology was a very popular pseudoscience in these days. And so he takes his calipers out and measures all the dimensions of Marlowe's head. And Marlowe says, and when they come back, do you remeasure the heads? And the doctor says, oh, I never see them. The changes take place inside, you know. This, it seems to me, is a foreshadowing of just what sort of disintegration will go on. The doctor warns Marlowe that there is a bigger danger, a graver danger than sunstroke. The doctor says, avoid irritation more than exposure to the sun. Now, this turns out to be a very useful piece of advice for Marlowe. Avoid irritation more than exposure. And the changes all take place inside, you know.
I wonder if there is a sense of criticism, too, of phrenology here on Conrad's part. That the doctor is, in other words, just a little mad.
Well, Marlowe says, I thought him a harmless fool. It does give Conrad a good opportunity to insist upon the fact that the drama which he is about to describe is internal rather than external. Kurt's disease is more a disease of the soul than of the body.
But also, as I was saying, in connection with the strange interest in phrenology on the part of the doctor, it simply shows that these wise people out here, away from the darkness, are not too bright either, and that civilization is not as far advanced, even in the places of light, as they would like it to be. And perhaps again it emphasizes that to Marlowe, the British were much more in possession of the light, perhaps, than here the French or the Dutch, whichever this is.
Yes.
I suspect that this is either Amsterdam or Paris. I'm not sure which.
I had guessed perhaps Brussels, since the notorious Belgian exploitation of what's now known as the Belgian Congo is an infamous page in the white man's history.
Yes, I think...
but I honestly don't know what city he refers to.
No, I like that better. I'd like to point out something interesting in one of the paragraphs that we brushed by. This is the paragraph beginning, there was yet a visit to the doctor. A simple formality assured me the secretary. This line, these words, assured me the secretary, to me are evidence of Conrad's use of English as a second language. And I think we can find many other places along the line in Conrad. Although he is one of the great masters of the English language, every once in a while one will find a clumsy place, an awkward place, and I have the feeling that we would say it, and that an American would write this, there was yet a visit to the doctor, a simple formality the secretary assured me.
Yes, I think an interesting piece of literary history, I wouldn't want to confuse it with literary criticism. An interesting piece of literary history is that Conrad is a man who operated in 3 languages. Born to Pole, he came to England where he wrote, and in some reminiscences written by Ford Maddox Ford, Ford reports that Conrad spoke and composed in French and then laboriously translated into English. In fact, he collaborated with Ford on at least 3 novels simply because the simple act of English composition was so laborious that his family was starving to death because his output was so slight.
I've heard that when Conrad wrote, that he would become so completely involved in his problem that no one dared disturb him. And I heard a story about a friend knocking at the door one day and not hearing an answer and walking into the room while Conrad was lying on the floor, actually wrestling with a manuscript. And that when he noticed that someone had had the temerity to move into the room, he jumped up from his manuscript and flew to the man's throat. And that he evinced this extreme protectiveness about his time when spent writing. Now we move to the conclusion of the preparations of Marlowe for his trip. He then goes back to England and goes to say goodbye to the lady whom he calls my excellent aunt. She was a little concerned. She says, "Good heavens, and I was going to take charge of a 2-penny halfpenny river steamboat with a penny whistle attached." The 2-penny halfpenny, of course, we sometimes hear in little nursery rhymes as 2-penny halfpenny or 2-penny halfpenny. Here he says then, "It appeared, however, I was also one of the workers with a capital W, with a capital, you know, something like an emissary of light." And this pleases his aunt as she discusses these things with him. And then she talked about weaning those ignorant millions from their horrid words. And she said this, says Marlowe, till, upon my word, she made me quite uncomfortable. To which, he says, I ventured to hint that the company was run for profit. I don't know that we need to discuss much more on that particular point. I think we're ready to begin now this new story. We have found that when we thought we were beginning the story, we were actually into only a second frame, like a group of Chinese nested boxes. But I think now we are ready to begin the story proper.
Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Discussing this novel are Professor Alfred Marks and Professor Joseph Satterwhite.
It's interesting, Al, to see here that Conrad shows us something of his attitude toward women. Marlowe has been somewhat sarcastic with his aunt when she talks about, quote, weaning those ignorant millions from their horrid ways, end of quote. He becomes so embarrassed that he ventures to hint the company was run for profit. And then he tells his listeners that women live quite outside the pale, that they are creatures who cannot survive or look at human nature, that they must live in a world of their own, quite divorced from reality. It's queer how out of touch with truth women are. They live in a world of their own, and there had never been anything like it, and there never can be. It's too beautiful altogether, and if they were to set it up, it would go to pieces before the first sunset. This, I think, definitely prepares us for the culminating scenes of the novel, which I will leave until the proper time.
Yes, I think it does. The treatment of the fiancée at that time is certainly motivated here. Well, our journey begins. He says, I left in a French steamer, and she called in every blamed port they have out there. For, as far as I could see, the sole purpose of landing soldiers and custom house officers. Sometimes it seems this way in connection with arriving at a place one thinks one is civilized and finding nothing there but soldiers. Then they in these stops, they drop off, take on soldiers and drop off soldiers. And some of them, he says, some I heard got drowned in the surf. They don't seem to be very careful about them. But whether they did or not, nobody seemed particularly to care. They were just flung out there, and on we went. And then he comes, at one point, they pass a gunboat. And he describes the gunboat. Her ensign dropped limp like a rag. The muzzles of the long 6-inch guns stuck all over the low hull. The greasy, slimy swell swung her up lazily and let her down, swaying her thin mast. In the empty immensity of earth, sky, and water, there she was, incomprehensible, firing into a continent. What seems to be our symbolism there, Joe?
Well, I suppose Conrad's up to his old trick of making ironic comments about the ineffectualness of human activity. Here's the white man with his civilization in the form of a highly complex gunboat firing shells into a continent, the puny effect of which is not even visible from the gunboat. Is there more?
And of all things they're throwing in there, it's just shells.
Yes.
And this is symbolic somewhat of the white man's burden, isn't it?
I think so. Marlowe points out, he says, there was a touch of insanity in the proceeding. I think we ought to emphasize over and over again that Conrad is a confirmed pessimist. He doesn't think men are capable of much, and he's seldom disappointed. He usually finds them accomplishing very little, and that very little doubtful.
I don't know the origin of the term white man's burden, and if you know any more about it than I wish you would mention it. I don't know exactly who coined it. Do you know where it came from? I think of it, of course, as referring to the sense of the civilizing duty that certain European countries felt that they had to carry out in the world.
Yes, I agree.
And like as in this altercation with his aunt, in which the aunt said, "You're going to reform those millions," and he said, "Well, the company is run for profit," there was, behind the noise about the white man's burden, perhaps a strong drive for profit. And maybe the white man wasn't really interested in helping the savage so much as he was interested in milking him. And so we have this image of the gunboat popping away into a continent.
The very fact of economic exploitation, there comes a concomitant responsibility, which is onerous in the extreme. Faulkner, constantly talks about the white man's burden in the South. The white man who's exploited the Negro, who has kept him economically and intellectually depressed, and now he's saddled with the whole enormous responsibility, not only for his act, but for the human products which his act has produced. I think the term white man's burden is a nicely ambiguous one, and we've perhaps explored at least two of its meanings.
Then he describes a little more about the gunboat. He says, "We gave her letters. I heard the men in that lonely ship were dying of fever at the rate of 3 a day, and went on." And there's almost a sense, too, about the futility of this particular mission that he himself is making, because here they hand out these letters, many of whom are addressed to men who have already died on the boat. And then he says at the end of the paragraph, "It was like a weary pilgrimage amongst hints for nightmares," as if one would have to search for nightmares. Then, several paragraphs on, we have at the end of a paragraph the words, "After all, I also was a part of the great cause of these high and just proceedings." This brings us then in doing so, of course, I am passing by these first important scenes of what he finds about him here, but it ties together this great scene of dilapidation that he sees, with people very busy, seemingly getting nothing done, and then this Negro in a uniform jacket with one button off, who, on seeing a white man on the path, hoists his weapon to his shoulder with alacrity, and then who, on seeing that he doesn't say anything to him, decides that he can take him into his confidence and therefore does not have to act too busy for him. Do you have any comments on this first description of
Well, I think every reader of the novel ought to read very carefully Marlowe's impression of the first base which he reaches. It's a spot characterized by absolute chaos. Great heaps of stores have been allowed to burst and to rot. A great deal of effort is being expended on apparently senseless projects. Blasting is taking place. Holes are being dug, all for no purpose. I think the impression you get is one of great activity which is vitiated by no purpose. The natives are being abused, are being worked to death, literally. But there's no direction, no purpose, no informing integrity to the work. I find the scene highly symbolic. And in the midst of all this chaos, Al, we find one of the typically saved people that Conrad is so interested in. It's the accountant. This man who, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of lunatic activity, maintains his own integrity by his twin devotions: his devotion to work and his devotion to maintaining the proper front in the midst of chaos and anarchy. I'm reminded of the famous cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker. The two Englishmen are on a safari, and it's time for dinner. They are surrounded by their half-naked beaters and burden bearers. They're in the jungle, and yet they both have dressed for dinner, white jacket and black tie. I think the accountant belongs to this group of men who maintain their inner integrity by maintaining the civilized dress that they're accustomed to.
I'd like to discuss further both your points. I'd like to take them one at a time. In connection with the chaos of the development here, he talks about it using the metaphor, the devil, and says, "I foresaw that in that blinding sunshine of that land, I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly." He compares this flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil with other devils. Now, what does he mean by this devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly? What is this flabby devil? He says, "I've seen the devil of violence, and the devil of greed, and the devil of hot desire. But by all the stars, these were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men, I tell you." So somehow these devils are important to him. He wouldn't mind if he saw the devil of violence here, or the devil of greed, or the devil of hot desire.
As a matter of fact, this explains, Al, why later, when he is forced to choose, he chooses curts to the other men. You remember that later in the story he says, "I chose my nightmare." I think I understand what you're driving at. You can recognize the integrity of violence, the integrity of lust, the integrity of greed. They represent things that you can be honest and true to. But the flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil is the devil of I suspect, rapacious hypocrisy. And And what's particularly insidious about this sort of thing is that it leaves its practitioners with nothing they can be true to. They're actually hollow men. They are whitened sepulchres. Is this what you were driving
Yes,
around?
I think so. And then, so in the word flabby, he means that it is not only lazy, it is also overeating.
Yes.
That it is pretending. And by pretending, I think he means that it is not only hypocritical, but it knows that it is hypocritical, that it knows that it is playing a part.
And this saps what integrity it may have. I think this helps to explain what Baudelaire meant when he said it is better to do evil than to do nothing. You can admire any sort of heroic activity, even the heroism inspired by lust or by violence or by greed, but these people are doing nothing. They are creating chaos rather than any kind of order.
And then he says that the devil that seems to run them, or that they seem to worship, whether they know it or not, is weak-eyed, meaning that it is short-sighted. They don't realize what is going to happen, what the future is. It is rapacious, meaning that it consumes without thought of what it consumes or how it consumes, and that it is pitiless, and above all, it is entirely foolish. It makes no sense at all. Then, to the clerk, I'd like to call him the chief accountant here, who is so happy that his books always balance, who somehow has managed to maintain himself in this wilderness with these two seemingly meaningless things, these things that are not really integral to human ideals, simply the matter of figures and his own starched linen.
Mm-hmm. This idea perhaps baffles modern students, those who have not read perhaps as widely as they should. The salvation through routine, it seems to me, is an important motif in Western literature. I think particularly of Turgenev's Fathers and Children, in which an aristocratic family living in the deserts, almost as it were, maintains its integrity through the habitual exercise of routine gestures, tea, dressing for dinner, that sort of thing. It's important here to recognize that this formality, this ritual, is a preserver.
This is quite important, too, is it not, in Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock?
Yes, indeed.
Prufrock loves dressing for toast and tea. He's very much concerned about whether he will wear the bottoms of his trousers rolled, and whether he will part his hair behind, and whether he will eat a peach.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the costume becomes a ceremony which gives meaning to life, I think. I don't think I'm going too far afield to point out that the same sort of routine or same sort of ceremony holds the peasants together in a novel like Hardy's The Return of the Native. It's a repetitive ritual, the performance of which gives a certain purpose to life. Now, the idea of work as salvation has always interested me. I collect little epigrams to that effect. Chaucer has a poem that begins, "Great happiness lies in little busyness." I've never been able to convince myself of the truth of this aphorism. Nevertheless, it's quite apparent that the accountant is saved from the general chaos by his devotion to doing his job well. And the only objections he makes is that it's very tough to make correct entries when one is surrounded by the natives.
It's interesting then to see that the paragraph describing the accountant ends, "And he was devoted to his books, which were in apple pie order," and then the next paragraph begins, "Everything else in the station was in a muddle. Heads, things, buildings." It's filled with muddled heads and muddled things and muddled buildings. And then he says, "Strings of dusty niggers with splay feet awry departed, a stream of manufactured goods, rubbishy cottons, beads, and brass wire set into the depths of darkness, and in return came a precious trickle of ivory."
Do you think it's unfair or out of place to observe now that for Conrad, one of the things that saves men from their own depravity is devotion to work?
Yes, at least this particular man is saved from it by devotion to work. I'd say that this is one important thing about the flabby devil, is that in his laziness, he avoids work. I'd say that the doctrine of work is quite important.
Well, I'd like to refine the point just a little bit. Somewhere Conrad says, I believe in this novel, Marlowe says, that most of us are simply not capable of looking at our true natures and surviving. And for these people, life then becomes a series of subterfuges. If you can keep busy, then you don't look. My guess is the accountant has not yet had time to look at the decay and the anarchy which surround him, at least not closely enough to recognize that he has the same potentiality in himself.
Yes, and I rather suspect that he is never going to look.
Yes, precisely.
And
he's safely rutted in his routine, I think you might say.
Yes, and this is a very important limitation then of the accountant, and perhaps this in a way also shows another aspect of the flabby devil, which also has control over the accountant. Because remember, the flabby devil is also weak-eyed, and the accountant refuses to see the difficulties about him. He doesn't attempt to cope with these, he only attempts to cope with these two basic concerns.
I still think that Conrad feels he's a lucky man. He has never seen the heart of darkness, and so he's spared the unnerving sight that destroys so many people in Conrad. I think you'll later see that Marlowe himself attributes his own survival to the fact that he's kept so infernally busy holding his little steamboat together that he doesn't have time to worry about the anxieties that press in on him.
I think that is true. Then we go on to our introduction to the man who is going to be so important later on in the story. We hear the accountant say, "In the interior you will no doubt meet Mr. Kurtz." Further questions elicited from him that Mr. Kurtz was at present in charge of a trading post, a very important one in the true ivory country, at the very bottom of there, sends in as much ivory as all the others put together. The introduction of Kurtz comes about against an interesting backdrop. A sick man has been brought into the office and lies here on a truckle bed, and he is described as some invalid agent from up country. And the accountant is quite annoyed by this. He says, "The groans of this sick person distract my attention." And without that, it is extremely difficult to guard against clerical errors in this climate. Clerical errors, of course, keep him away from, or his clerical concerns keep him away from seeing the things that happen here. And then, with the groaning of this invalid agent in the background, a man somewhat similar to Marlowe, a man whom perhaps Marlowe associates himself with a little bit, or at least identifies himself with a little bit, the accountant says, "When you see Mr. Kurtz, tell him from me that everything here is very satisfactory." As if the accountant is reporting to Kurtz way back there at the end of the line. I don't like to write to him. With those messages of ours, you never know who may get hold of the letter at that central station. And then it seems to be clear that something is wrong, that the communication between this point and the point where Kurtz is is quite poor, and that there are all kinds of individuals along the way who are apt to cause trouble. Then the accountant makes it clear why he is reporting way out there to Kurtz. He says, "Oh, he will go far, very far," he began again. "He will be a somebody in the administration before long. They, above, the council in Europe, you know, mean him to be." And then the description is given of the room itself. In the steady buzz of flies, the homeward-bound agent was lying flushed and insensible. The other, bent over his books, was making correct entries of perfectly correct transactions, and 50 feet below the doorstep I could see the still treetops of the grove of death. This grove had been described earlier, of course, in which Marlowe found many natives lying in all kinds of attitudes of death and near death, lying here discarded by the white man, waiting for death. There's an interesting irony then after 2 paragraphs that reads, well, if a lot of mysterious niggers armed with all kinds of fearful weapons suddenly took to traveling on the road between Deal and Gravesend, catching the yokels right and left to carry heavy loads for them, I fancy every farm and cottage thereabouts would get empty pretty soon. This description, then, of certain empty villages along the way as they tramp into the wilderness and into the jungle, and the comparison of it with England. And he looks at it from the standpoint of wondering what would happen if this were done by natives, if natives had done this in England. It reminds me in its irony of Mark Twain's work on the white man's burden, entitled To One Who Is Sitting in Darkness. And the irony here is almost at times seems to make it look as if Conrad had read the essay that I'm talking about.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt of what Mark Twain and Conrad look at the world in the same way. Maybe we ought to get up to the central station. The next few pages are concerned with Marlowe's trek by foot from the seacoast into the next staging area, which is called the Central Station.
I just wanted to mention on the way another interesting ironic line where he says, "A great silence around and above, perhaps on some quiet night the tremor of far-off drums sinking, swelling, a tremor vast, faint, a sound weird, appealing, suggestive and wild, and perhaps with as profound a meaning as the sound of bells in a Christian country." The comparison is quite interesting, I think, of the sound of the bells to a Christian country and the sound of drums to savages. And then after that, we see this white man in an unbuttoned uniform camping on the path with an armed escort of lank Zanzibaris. Now, Zanzibar is on the eastern coast of Africa, and this may indicate for us that this river debouches onto the east coast of Africa.
If it does, then the colonizers are more likely to be German than otherwise, because German Southwest Africa, I believe, is in the vicinity of Zanzibar. The interesting thing about the Central Station, I think, is the further information about Kurtz that it provides. I think our responsibility now, Al, is to try to look at the novel as closely as we can to find out what sort of figure Kurtz becomes for Marlowe. When he meets the manager of the Central Station, he finds that the man admires Kurtz and fears him too, and apparently there's some sort of plot underfoot to destroy Kurtz, or at least to lessen his effectiveness. The manager of the Central Station says that Kurtz is the best agent he had, an exceptional man, and yet that he's very uneasy about Kurtz because he hasn't been heard from, hasn't been seen in a year and a half, although the shipments of ivory come regularly. Let's see if we can find some specific passages which will indicate the sort of value Kurtz takes on for Marlowe.
I think that the picture that Kurtz has given to one of these men at the Central Station is quite important.
Yes.
This is described as a small sketch in oils on a panel representing a woman draped and blindfolded carrying a lighted torch. The background was somber, almost black. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister. I'd prefer it if you'd comment on it.
Well, I think the picture, which is painted by Kurtz, reveals Kurtz's original idealism. For me, the woman is an unmistakably symbolic figure. She stands, I think, for enlightenment and perhaps also for justice, since the figure of justice is traditionally blindfolded. She's carrying a lighted torch into the darkness. When we later discover that Kurtz has been commissioned by the Society for the Suppression of Native Cruelties, we begin to see some of the things about Kurtz that do interest Marlowe. What would you say about the picture, Al, that Kurtz has painted?
I agree there basically with this. I think it's very important that the picture was painted before he went to the station.
Exactly. Yes.
So that it shows the idealism in Kurtz, and this is something that Marlowe finds so important.
Al, do you want to say anything more about the picture which Kurtz has painted?
No, nothing more than what I've just said.
The next information about Kurtz, which Marlowe picks up, is from a minor official at the Central Station. He's the brickmaker of the Central Station. Oddly enough, some material for his brickmaking venture has not arrived, and so he has no work to do. He's idle. But he tells Marlowe something about Kurtz. He says, quote, "He, Kurtz, is a prodigy. He is an emissary of pity and science and progress, and the devil knows what else. We want, for the guidance of the cause entrusted to us by Europe, so to speak, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. Apparently, Kurtz is this man. Today, Kurtz is chief of the best station. Next year, he will be assistant manager. 2 years more. Well, I dare say you know what he will be in 2 years' time." A wonderfully ambiguous remark. "You are the new gang, the gang of virtue. The same people who sent him also recommended you." This is the first definite hint we have that Kurtz and Marlowe are to be identified, or that Marlowe sees in Kurtz a reflection of himself. Al?
There's also in this calling him the chief of the inner station, again the same association of imagery that we get with the heart of the darkness, and the inner station also seems to mean, symbolically again, that the heart of darkness is meant to represent the very center of a person's personality, which it behooves him at some time to burrow into, to find out the things that he really believes in, and to find out if he will really have the courage to maintain his convictions under some terrible stress. I'd like to, I find that in our discussion of Kurtz himself, we are running a little ahead, and I wonder if we can profitably discuss here a little bit the Central Station itself. There are so many interesting things about the Central Station, and we are given to understand by Marlowe, as he looks at it, that he remembered the old doctor and the statement of the old doctor. It would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. And then he looks at the station and says, the flabby devil was running that show. He could see that before long without any difficulty. And then, speaking of what happens to a man, he looks at the head of the central station. He's amazed by the constitution of the man. He'd been out there 3 years, and he had this triumphant health in the general rout of constitutions. And he says it was great by this little thing, or he was great by this little thing, that it was impossible to tell what could control such a man. Perhaps there was nothing within him, another hollow man, so he stands up. Such a suspicion made one pause, for out there were no external checks. And we're going to hear a great deal about the problem of getting along without external checks.
Apparently the central station is staffed almost entirely by hollow men. Several pages later, Marlowe talks about the brickmaker who makes no bricks, and he finds him a very despicable figure. Apparently the brickmaker has expected to be made manager, and now he sees that Kurtz's a rival. Marlowe says of him, he calls him a papier-mâché Mephistopheles, and it seemed to me that if I tried, I could poke my fourth finger through him and would find nothing inside but a little loose dirt, maybe. I think the central station is another variation on the seacoast main staging area, chaos and lack of purpose.
I think there's a symbolic meaning, too, in the man who waits for bricks. The bricks, I believe, are symbolic of the white man's architecture, of the civilized architecture. And the brickmaker is, in a way, waiting here to build a modern city, or modern buildings of these bricks. But of course, they cannot make that much of an impression. They cannot bring civilization here to that extent, and so the bricks never come.
There's another function of this man's idleness. Since he does nothing, he decays the more rapidly. Marlowe tells us that on his arrival at the central station, where incidentally he finds the steamboat he is to command has been sunk, that he himself immediately goes to work because his absorption in work protects him from the emptiness of the station. I went to work the next day, he says, turning, so to speak, my back on that station. In that way only, it seemed to me that I could keep my hold on the redeeming facts of life. Still, he says, one must look about sometimes. And when he does, he sees the emptiness of his associates.
Yes, and then, speaking of the brickmaker again, after a time he says of him, it seems he could not make bricks without something, I don't know what, straw maybe. Anyways, it could not be found there, and as it was not likely to be sent from Europe, it did not appear clear to me what he was waiting for. An act of special creation, perhaps. And this is an interesting statement, because it brings us directly into the center of the evolution controversy, during which it was felt that species had been created along the line by special creation. This was by the conservatives and by those who were interested in the letter of the Bible, and were saying that God had created species specially, that each species was created separately and specially. And there is almost an ironic reference to this controversy, which Conrad perhaps feels has been resolved in favor of the evolutionists. Then, to go back to Marlowe starting work, we see him looking at the men about him. They wandered here and there with their absurd long staves in their hands, like a lot of faithless pilgrims bewitched inside a rotten fence. The word ivory rang in the air, was whispered, was sighed. You would think they were praying to it. And outside, the silent wilderness surrounding this cleared speck on the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion. What do you think of this term, pilgrim, here?
Well, it's obviously ironic. I don't know that I'm prepared to take it much further. Of course, with their staves, their long sticks, which they use incidentally to beat the natives, I suppose they visually remind one of people on a quest, perhaps pilgrims who walk great distances with great deprivation and suffering toward some spiritual Mecca. These people are pilgrims, but pilgrims in sedan chairs and in the midst of luxury, as it were. Without any strong spiritual purpose, too, I might add. Excuse me.
Yes, and then it becomes clear that the shrine that they are marching to is certainly built of ivory. The Holy of Holies is made of ivory, and it is entirely possible that even though they don't know it, the shrine that they worship is this marvelous construction of curts, about which they know very little, and about which some of them would just as soon be snidely critical.
Yes, while we're speaking of pilgrims, it might be wise to point out a special batch that arrive at the central station. They are known as the El Dorado Exploring Expedition. While Marlowe is trying to refit his wrecked steamboat, this group of pilgrims arrive. Marlowe speaks of them as an infliction, a visitation, a quarrelsome band of footsore, sulky niggers accompanied by pilgrims. This devoted band, I'm quoting, called itself the El Dorado Exploring Expedition, and I believe they were sworn to secrecy. Now, the point of this discussion is that these people, in a way, adumbrate. They sum up the pointless, undevoted, selfish, flabby, devilish quest for riches.
Yes, the paragraph goes on.
Yeah, their talk was the talk of sordid buccaneers. It was reckless without hardihood, greedy without audacity, cruel without courage. There was not an atom of foresight nor of serious intention in the whole batch of them, and they did not seem aware these things are wanted for the work of the world. To tear treasure out of the bowels of the earth was their desire, with no more moral purpose at the back of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe. And I think it's interesting that the El Dorado Exploring Association disappears into the wilderness and is never heard of again.
Yes.
A sinister but suitable end.
And then the ironic word at the beginning of it, El Dorado.
Yes.
This is used in, is it the beginning of the vision of Sir Launfal, or is it gaily bedight, a gallant knight in sunshine and in shadow had journeyed long, singing a song in search of El Dorado.
Excelsior. Longfellow is not
Longfellow's Excelsior, is it?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And here then El Dorado becomes the land that lies at the end of the rainbow. Mm-hmm. And it's this beautiful, pure joy that lies at the end of the quest. And certainly it was a very strange name to be chosen by these particular men, although I think I recall names of this kind used in mining camps in the American West, which were certainly staffed, in spite of the fact of what we hear in Death Valley days or some of our television programs, which was certainly staffed by men of not a very much higher morality than the men of the El Dorado Exploring Expedition.
Yes, but I dare say they were men characterized by hardihood, audacity, and courage. Now, Marlowe is quick to point out that these people are reckless, that they're greedy, and that they're cruel, but they lack hardihood, audacity, and courage. Without these further ingredients, the El Dorado Exploring Expedition is doomed.
It is certainly very important to Americans to think of their pioneers and their frontiersmen as having hardihood, audacity, and courage. We, however, get pictures every once in a while that some of our figures, like, let us say, Davy Crockett, were not necessarily filled with these three qualities.
Well, not necessarily, and yet their lengthy survival seems to indicate that they were. I don't think Conrad here is making a brief for nice people. so much as he is for people who combine devotion with capacity. The trouble with a lot of people in Conrad is that they undertake, through ignorance of themselves, jobs that they're simply not fitted for. Now, Davy Crockett may not be an admirable character, but apparently he was well suited for the career he marked out for himself. These people are simply greedy without the capacity to satisfy their greed, I think.
Well, the description of the central station goes on, and the experience of Marlowe in the central station while he is repairing his boat goes on. He smells the mud about him and describes it of primeval mud, by Jove, and then describes the forest about him as the high stillness of primeval forest.
Mm-hmm.
And then he complains about the fact that there is something mendacious about the pilgrims. They lie to him, and he says, Marlowe says in an aside, there is a taint of death, a flavor of mortality in lies, which is exactly what I hate and detest in the world, what I want to forget. It makes me miserable and sick, like biting something rotten would do. And so, in this fetid air, the story prepares itself for, again, is this our fourth step in our journey? I think we've had 3 frames now. Or is it 4 frames to the journey that we still must make into the heart of darkness?
Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Discussing this novel are Professor Alfred Marks and Professor Joseph Satterwhite.
Marlowe's stay at the Central Station is characterized by 2 parallel developments. He observes the station and its lack of purpose and its chaos, and he also acquires fresh knowledge about Kurtz. For example, after Marlowe tells us about the El Dorado exploring expedition, he returns to the parallel theme of Kurtz. Al, would you like to continue our discussion of what Kurtz comes to mean to Marlowe?
Yes, there are 2 things involved here. First, in a discussion shortly before the end of Chapter 1, we shifted back to Marlowe, to the ship, the Nellie, before it moves off, and we see the men talking together. And Marlowe talks about the difficulties around him, and he says, it seems to me I am trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt, because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation. He says, no, it is impossible. It is impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence. Marlowe tries to say how difficult it is for the whole story that he is trying to tell to be told properly. And then we move to the narrator here, who isn't Marlowe, who is another one of these men on the Nellie. And the man says, I listened on the watch for the sentence, for the word that would give me the clue to the faint uneasiness inspired by this narrative. Well, we are looking for something then, perhaps, at the center of the narrative, in spite of Conrad's metaphor of composition used earlier. And so, at the end of the chapter, we're given these words. I had plenty of time for meditation, and now and then I would give some thought to Kurtz. I wasn't very interested in him, no. Still, I was curious to see whether this man, who had come out equipped with moral ideas of some sort, would climb to the top, after all, and how he would set about his work when there. And so, the end of the chapter is focused forward on what must come in the later chapters, on the way in which what happened and what will happen to Kurtz will be a revelation to Marlowe
who is observing this.
At the beginning of chapter 2, there's an interesting scene during which Marlowe accumulates more knowledge about Kurtz. He's lying, trying to sleep on the deck of his steamboat, which apparently is tied up at a dock, and the manager of the central station and his younger relative, that is his nephew, come strolling by. And Marlowe overhears their conversation in a broken fashion. He gets parts of sentences and phrases, but he quickly senses that these two men are talking about Kurtz. And from this fragmentary conversation, his curiosity about the nature of Kurtz is whetted. I don't propose to read anything here, but the conversation goes like this. It's very unpleasant that Kurtz is succeeding so well, because he represents a threat to the accession of the nephew and the uncle to more responsible positions. Despite the fact that he sends out ivory in a constant stream, he is nevertheless ill. And these two gentlemen are very hopeful that Kurtz will perish in the interior. Previously, he has sent out his half-caste assistant with all the ivory, and he, Kurtz, though desperately ill, has returned to the interior station. Now, these two men hope that disease will carry Kurtz off. Disease will carry Kurtz off. They also hope that they may be able to do something to interrupt Kurtz's rise, because, as one says to the other, anything can be done in this country. I find this a very meaningful phrase. But this overheard conversation again whets Marlowe's interest in Kurtz.
And the line is interesting in which in the darkness, he sees the uncle speak to the other man, and his arm seemed to beckon with a dishonoring flourish before the sunlit face of the land, a treacherous appeal to the lurking death, to the hidden evil, to the profound darkness of its heart. And this begins to give us a greater understanding of the central term of the book, its title, of course, Heart of Darkness.
Yes, so at this point we see Kurtz as an idealized figure, one who has gone into the bush with high ideals and one who is menaced by these hypocritical hollow men at the central station. Small wonder, then, that Marlowe anxiously awaits his meeting with Kurtz.
Yes, and we are given quite specifically something about Kurtz here. The words are, as to me, I seem to see Kurtz for the first time. It was a distinct glimpse. And it's one of these glimpses that we get so often in Conrad, this intuitive leap that Conrad so often uses. One leaps intuitively off to assume something he had no right to assume, seemingly, but which turns out to be right. It was a distinct glimpse. The dugout, 4 paddling savages, and the lone white man turning his back suddenly on the headquarters, on relief, on thoughts of home perhaps, setting his face towards the depth of the wilderness, toward his empty and desolate station. I did not know the motive, but of course the discovery of the motive is going to concern us a great deal as we go on in the book.
Of course, the next line, which you chose not to read, is interesting. Perhaps it was just he was simply a fine fellow who stuck to his work for his own sake. An interesting supposition that proved false.
This is an important thing about Conrad, and it emphasizes our particular problem in trying to get a discussion of this over with in not too many hours, and certainly not more hours than it would take a good reader to read the book. But when one finds a quotation that is meaningful in Conrad, one very often finds that the next sentence says even better what the sentences have already said, and there is this tight unity about the work that makes it very difficult to extricate anything from it.
At any rate, here we are almost halfway on our journey to Kurtz, who becomes the central figure in the novel, as a matter of fact, because at this point the steamboat has been repaired. Marlowe takes command of this boat. and with a load of pilgrims, that is, 5 or 6 white men, with rifles and staves, he begins the painful, slow ascent of the river to the inland station where Kurtz awaits him.
Then there's an interesting irony in the trip. He says, he describes the stillness about him in the water. But he says, this stillness of life did not in the least resemble a peace. It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention. But he says that he, as you mentioned before, he manages to keep going because he has to keep this pot of the steamboat boiling somehow. And he says, when you have to attend to things of that sort, to the mere incidents of the surface, the reality, I tell you, fades. The inner truth is hidden. Luckily, but I felt it all the same. I felt often its mysterious stillness watching me at my monkey tricks. And so he is concerned here with the reality that he would, for a time, just as soon avoid, but that he must sooner or later come face to face with.
There's a certain amount of comic relief on the steamboat trip. I'm sure our listeners have read it carefully. But together with the ominous scenery, there is a sort of grim humor. For example, the crew is made up of cannibals who has brought with them certain quantities of decayed hippopotamus meat, the miasma of which floats over the steamboat. Marlowe also half-seriously speculates about what kind of restraint it is that keeps the crew from eating the passengers, since the hippo meat is soon exhausted. It seems to me this is a somewhat sardonically lighthearted passage in the novel, and well worth some attention.
Yes, I think it does, however, come on a little further on in a novel, and perhaps we should skip it for now. I think, however, it is an extremely important passage in the novel. He describes the journey then upstream, and uses words like, we penetrated deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. And then, when they come around a bend, they hear a burst of yells and a whirl of black limbs, a mass of hands clapping, of feet stamping, of bodies swaying, of eyes rolling under the droop of heavy and motionless foliage. And he says of the noise that they hear, the prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? And he says, we could not understand because we were too far and could not remember because we were traveling in the night of first ages, of those ages that are gone, leaving hardly a sign and no memories. And this brings us to a very important intellectual concern in the novel, and an important intellectual confusion here. We have involved civilized man on the one hand. We have involved, too, man of a much earlier state of evolution, man who is almost back in the days of a kind of primeval ooze. And we see again that Conrad has embraced evolution here. And there is also the problem of the interaction of the forest primeval and of primeval man with modern man, and of what happens.
It's it's almost as if man has developed by accretion rather than by mutation. As Marlowe looks at the savages, he recognizes that although he has a thin veneer, that within he's just as savage, just as primitive as these natives are. It's an interesting theory that we carry with us the vestiges of our origin and of our long, slow development.
Yes, it's actually good late 19th century Lamarckian evolutionism of the kind that Shaw uses in Man and Superman, that men change by learning rather than changing by mutation.
Yes. And Marlowe speculates that you look at these people and you suddenly realize that they're not inhuman. They're just very elementary humans. and you are forced to admit your kinship with these howling savages that line the bank. And he says, the mind of man is capable of anything because everything is in it, all the past as well as all the future. Let the fool gape and shudder, the man knows and can look on without a wink.
And then he says of man in this wilderness, he must at least be as much of a man as these on shore. He must meet that truth with his own true stuff, with his own inborn strength. Principles won't do. Acquisitions, clothes, pretty rags, rags that would fly off at the first good shake. No, you want a deliberate belief. Now, we can spend a good deal of time on what this deliberate belief is, but suffice it to say at this time that when men come in to the wilderness, when modern man comes in and lives in the wilderness for a time and does not have the belief that enables him to be superior to the wilderness, he brings down the wilderness and makes of it a world of darkness.
Al, if you'll permit, I'd like to make a mild disagreement here. You have suggested that Heart of Darkness and the jungle are not equivalent, that human depravity creates Heart of Darkness in the jungle. I'd like to say this, that as I read the novel, the jungle is the heart of darkness, that the human heart is ultimately the heart of darkness, a human heart capable of the most enormous depravities. If this be so, then Marlowe here is talking about the various ways in which a man can avoid committing depravities which reveal him as having a heart of darkness. He says, for example, a fool can avoid these depravities. He's always safe simply because he's never aware of what he is capable of being. Marlowe says that you want a deliberate belief to prevent your entering the heart of darkness. A deliberate belief connotes a sophisticated, elaborated principle or discipline which will simply not permit you to act as we later discover Kurtz did act. Do you understand what I'm trying to say, Al?
Yes, and I disagree with it. My feeling is that if Conrad meant for the entire jungle to represent darkness as such, or let us say the jungle with no white men there, with the white man back in Europe, that if he was thinking of this as being darkness, he would be in a sense consigning the jungle and all the natives to a kind of pre-Christian limbo. And I think it's clear that most of the time in here that he doesn't handle the prehistoric man as a lost soul or as an irretrievably lost soul. He doesn't handle the cannibals in that way. A little later on in the book, he doesn't handle even the pilot, the man at the wheel, who it's hard to say that he really is a pilot of any kind. In many ways, as I see it, the darkness is something that is gotten there when the European comes in and tries to remake this society in accordance with his own conflicting notions of what he wants, both idealistically and selfishly. And I'm bothered by the statement that is made way back when the young man Marlowe first looked at a map. And he said of this place that he wanted to go to so badly, this place that had nothing on it. And he says of it, true, by this time, and this is when he got a little bit older, it was not a blank space anymore. It had got filled since my boyhood with rivers and lakes and names. It had ceased to be a blank space of delightful mystery, a white patch for a boy to dream gloriously over. it had become a place of darkness. Now, to me, this means that once the names get fitted in, once civilization begins to move in on it, then it becomes darkness. Now, I'll admit that there's difficulty in working this out, and I'm a little puzzled about it, and perhaps not quite sure of myself that I can defend it completely. However, I don't feel that in this story, Conrad is thinking of evil and darkness as being exactly the same as the deepest jungle and the most primitive savages. And if I may point out, they are making this trip into the heart of darkness, but it is not entirely the primeval jungle. It is the primeval jungle into which a certain European has penetrated before them.
Oh, you're very persuasive, Al. Let me say in defense of my own theory that the jungle, with its primitive, elementary people, provides an opportunity for more sophisticated and more civilized people to see what they potentially are. We've already agreed that the savages and the white men are really the same people, the only difference being, as I see it, that the white man has had several centuries of accreted civilizing effect, but at heart, basically, he has the same capacity for depravity, the same capacity for evil as the savage. And the jungle is a heart of darkness because it provides the white man an opportunity to see what he himself is capable of. This is exactly what happens to Kurtz, if you'll permit me to anticipate our discussion. Kurtz goes into the jungle and has the opportunity to act in a depraved fashion, and in the absence of restraint, in the absence of police law, in the absence of the opinion of his companions, he becomes as depraved as the savages themselves.
I think that we can compare the darkness of Conrad with a contrast between Babylon, let us say, or Sodom and Gomorrah, and the garden into which Adam and Eve had brought sin, or the garden before they brought sin there.
Most apt comparison, Al. I agree entirely.
Then what I'm trying to say is that you have in the garden, let us say after Adam and Eve, or in Sodom and Gomorrah or Babylon, you have a definite sense of regression. You have a definite sense that man has done something that is not up to his potentiality, that there is I'm trying to think of a word. Is it in Paradise Lost, in which in which the words are used for Lucifer? What a falling down was there. And I think this is what the whole problem represents, a falling, and this is what darkness is. Now, I think that really Conrad isn't definite on this, and I think that it is important, however, to bring up the point and to look at the two sides of the problem as we have stated it. We go on after this statement, "No, you want a deliberate belief," and we have an interesting symbolism here where Marlowe says, "I had to watch the steering and circumvent those snags and get the tin pot along by hook or by crook." And this, I think, again shows us the kind of allegorical way that Conrad handles himself. This statement coming perhaps only about 8 lines after the words, "You want a deliberate belief," make it clear that the snags represent here the difficult things of the world that can tear one and bring one down, and that the tin pot becomes one's own body with all of its weaknesses that one has to guide along so carefully on the difficult path of life.
Al, that's ingenious. I'd like to restore this sentence to its context. Marlowe has been speaking, and he says, "No, you want a deliberate belief, that is, if you're to be saved from the depravity of these savages." And then he says, "Who's that grunting?" Apparently one of his auditors has made an unpleasant noise. And Marlowe says, "You wonder I didn't go ashore for a howl and a dance?" What he means is, do you wonder that I didn't return to the primitivism of these natives? And he says, "Well, no, I didn't. Not for fine sentiment's sake, but because I had no time." And then he says, "I had to mess around with white lead and strips of woolen blanket. I tell you, I had to watch the steering and circumvent those snags and get the tin pot along by hook or crook." I consider this the very heart of Conrad's theory, that if you keep busy, keep your nose to the grindstone, to be trite, if you lose yourself in your work, it reduces the opportunity for temptations toward the sort of depraved action that we later find Kurtz involved in.
That is so.
It reminds me of the French lieutenant, for example, in Lord Jim, or of the captain who was unaware of the dangers of the sea, who'd simply been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't realized what dangerous work he was engaged in.
Well, I see the context here, and as I see it, the context is brought in here very adroitly. They are saying, of course, that Marlowe is complaining about a deliberate belief there when really he doesn't have a deliberate belief, and he could very well have jumped out and howled with them. And then Marlowe says, well, really I might have succumbed, but I was paying too much attention to that tin pot. But I think in doing so, Marlowe uses the symbolism that makes it clear that a man in this life must watch for his steering, must watch where he's going, must have good laws of sublunary navigation in his mind if he wants to avoid the snags and hooks of life that can tear him apart. And I think this is partly what is meant by deliberate belief. Deliberate belief is, to use the nautical term again, a kind of chart by which a man sails.
At any rate, this paragraph concludes with this observation: "Thus neither that fireman," that is, one of the native crewmen of the ship, who was busy watching the water glass, "neither that fireman nor I had any time to peer into our creepy thoughts."
This is an interesting statement. It brings up many problems in connection with Conrad. Conrad says, I believe it is in Lord Jim, that the way to live is in the destructive element oneself to immerse.
Yes, Stein speaking, as I recall.
Yes. And I think that there is here a sense, of course, of not sinking into the destructive element because of being so concerned about what one was doing. But I think one might also say that Kurtz, or rather that Marlowe, is in the destructive element here, that he is sailing up the destructive element, and that he is working purposefully in the destructive element.
Oh, I agree with you. He's in the heart of darkness. If he ever has the leisure or the inquisitive spirit to investigate the opportunities for depraved and evil action, he'll be appalled at his discoveries. As long as he's busy or as long as he's unaware, he's in no danger.
And I think this is what's important about the entire trip, that we have Marlowe exposing himself here to the darkness. He has himself exposing himself to evil. And maybe it's just as well that we have this doubt here that both of us have expressed, or that is at the crux of our disagreement, and that is that there is doubt that he is really involving himself in evil at this time. Because when the evil comes, it must come as a shock, it must come with dramatic contrast, and so perhaps it is just as well that Conrad permits us to have some doubt about Marlowe's exposure or exposure of his deliberate belief to the incursions of evil and the snags of evil at this time. I don't have anything for the next few pages. Along the line here, he picks up this book, An Inquiry into Some Points of Seamanship, by a man. Eventually he finds the name Towson. I believe there is a Towson somewhere in Maryland. I think I met someone from Towson, Maryland not long ago, and it has made me think that perhaps this is a good name in seamanship. I don't know. Are you acquainted with the name at all, Dr. Satterwhite?
No. Bowditch is the book I studied in midshipman school. I think this book is interesting. Here in an abandoned wood station, amongst rubbish and debris, they discover this book on seamanship here in the middle of the African continent, and they discover that it's being read until it's almost ready to fall apart, and that a great many marginal notes have been made in what Marlowe believes to be a cipher or a code. Now, nothing further is said about the book. Marlowe takes the book with him, and much later in the novel we discover the owner of the book, a highly romantic Russian youth who serves, it seems to me, a very useful function in that he shows us one of the ways in which Kurt's depravity may be escaped. But I'm anticipating. I simply wanted to account for the appearance of this book on seamanship.
Yes, we will see then that what seems to be cipher here turns out probably to be Russian.
Russian, yes.
And that that in a way, I think the book here, left all alone in this little room or this little building here among the savages, seems to symbolize the way in which this kind of ability to sail through difficulty, intent on one's goal, can keep one from becoming involved in the difficulties of the world, as you said. And I think perhaps the word Towson or Towser or Towser, as he confused it at first, seems to mean that I believe that the man who is caught in these things might be thought of as being towed through the world, and perhaps, Dr. Satterwhite, you would be very happy to say here that it symbolizes the way in which such a man is not yet fully on his own in facing the difficult world. We have then to move on a few paragraphs, and he is concerned with their coming toward Kurtz now, and they are wondering where Kurt's place is going to be, and the manager seems to be intent on it. I fretted and fumed and took to arguing with myself whether or no I would talk openly with Kurtz, but before I could come to any conclusion, it occurred to me that my speech or my silence, indeed any action of mine, would be a mere futility. What did it matter what anyone knew or ignored? What did it matter who was manager? One gets sometimes such a flash of insight. The essentials of this affair lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach and beyond my power of meddling, perhaps meaning here that the whole outer world is disappearing for Marlowe, and he is becoming much more concerned with deep essentials that lie under human life, and perhaps the essential here is that he is no longer concerned with whether he gets up the river or down the river, but whether he gets out of this with his soul intact. Then I'd like to move on several paragraphs. When they come into this fog, and he says, "It was very curious to see the contrast of expressions of the white men and of the black fellows of our crew, who were as much strangers to that part of the river as we, though their homes were only 800 miles away. The whites, of course, greatly discomposed, had besides a curious look of being painfully shocked by such an outrageous row. The others had an alert, naturally interested expression, but their faces were essentially quiet." And then we move to a description of the cannibals.
he says of them, they still belong to the beginnings of time. And this is one of the things that interests me about the fact that the beginnings of time aren't necessarily thought of as being a corrupt time. And then he talks about the way in which these cannibals are so hungry. The whites threw away the hippo meat, the decaying hippo meat that these men were eating, and the poor men then have starved ever since and have not eaten very much. Yet in all their hunger, they do not succumb to the temptation to eat the whites who are with them, whom they outnumber. Marlowe says then, in admiration of the cannibals, it takes a man all his inborn strength to fight hunger properly. It's really easier to face bereavement, dishonor, and the perdition of one's soul than this kind of prolonged hunger. Sad but true, and these chaps too had no earthly reason for any kind of scruple. Restraint. I would just as soon have expected restraint from a hyena prowling amongst the corpses of a battlefield, but there was the fact facing me. So we have the restraint of the cannibals under these circumstances, and he speaks of this as being a fact dazzling to be seen, like the foam on the depths of the sea, like a ripple on an unfathomable enigma, a mystery greater when I thought of it than the curious, inexplicable note of desperate grief in this savage clamor that had swept by us on the riverbank behind the blind whiteness of the fog.
Well, I agree with you that it's important. It gives Marlowe an opportunity to talk about his favorite subject, to wit, restraint. Nevertheless, it is an inexplicable restraint. There are any number of satisfactory explanations for it. Perhaps white men are taboo. Perhaps white flesh cannot be eaten. I think it is somewhat. I think it's a mistake to assume that Marlowe is attributing to the savages a quality of restraint which would prohibit their committing any depraved acts such as those Kurtz performed.
Yes, but Marlowe does bring up a number of alternatives for their not eating the pilgrims. He says, restraint? What possible restraint? Was it superstition, disgust, patience, fear, or some kind of primitive honor? In other words, he gives your alternatives. And then he says of these, no fear can stand up to hunger. No patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is. And as to superstition, beliefs, and what you may call principles, they are less than chaff in a breeze. Don't you know the devilry of lingering starvation, its exasperating torment, its black thoughts, its somber and brooding ferocity? And so the cannibals are very important to them because they show him something that comes in to prevent a man from falling into darkness, from falling the final mile, perhaps, and that even when there's every reason to break the particular laws that hold him, and the man does not break these things for some inexplicable reason which Conrad might say is something divine in man, I'm not sure.
All right.
We move on then to the problems of the ship as it stands here in the fog. The manager tells Marlowe to do what he thinks best, and Marlowe seems to think it best to stay right there. Along the way, he mentions the cannibals again. This is about 4 paragraphs on from where we were, in which at the beginning of the paragraph, the cannibals are called my hungry and forbearing friends. The wonderful irony in this statement on the cannibals. Then, after a few paragraphs, the attack begins, and arrows come across at them and spears, and the pilgrims open up and start shooting, simply squirting lead into the bush, he says, and then even the pilot starts shooting the big Martini Henry out the window. Then suddenly something big appeared in the air before the shutter. The rifle went overboard, and the man stepped back swiftly, looked at me over his shoulder in an extraordinary, profound, familiar manner, and fell upon my feet. And there we have the death then of the helmsman, this man whom he had trained so inadequately to do his job, a man who seemed to do well when he was watching him, but when he had his back turned, he would immediately head the boat toward the bank or something like that. And then as the man dies, we have the description, only in the very last moment, as though in response to some sign we could not see, to some whisper we could not hear, he frowned heavily. And that frown gave to his black death mask an inconceivably somber, brooding, and menacing expression. This look on his face as he dies, we wonder if again this isn't something similar to the look that Kurtz will have on his face when he dies. Conrad seems to assert a belief in something happening just before a man dies. Now, I don't know, do you have a notion as to what this is or what this might be here with this man? Dr. Satterwhite?
No, as a matter of fact, I don't. I recall at the death of Kurtz that Marlowe describes it as a peek over the edge. I've always preferred to believe, in the face of the evidence, I might add, always chosen to believe that the peep over the edge refers to Kurtz's last clear vision of the potential depravity that every human heart carries with it. It seems to me that the death of the helmsman is a dramatic way of showing us the consequences of the lack of restraint. I find it interesting that Marlowe should describe the helmsman's act as being a failure of restraint. His job was to steer the boat. He drops the steering wheel or leaves it, picks up the rifle, begins to shoot into the bush, and is speared. It seems to me that this entire incident is simply a very dramatic statement of the consequences of the failure or the lack of restraint.
At any rate, the problem will come up later. We will have the difficulty of deciding whether Kurt's last second on Earth and the last second of this helmsman is taken up in looking back at the life that he has lived, or in looking forward to a world after death. And this will be, I think, rather difficult to determine precisely.
Seems to me, in view of what little I know about Conrad, is that of those two choices, the first is by all odds the more likely. Conrad, it seems to me, is almost perpetually concerned with proper conduct in this world. I find very little, at least in the Conrad I've read, very little interest in the world to come. If the peep over the edge means anything with regard to the last few moments of life, I should think that it would mean an extraordinarily clear-sighted view of the enormities one has committed in one's life through the lack of restraint.
There is difficulty, of course. We'll take up this word, a peep over the edge, this phrase, which I don't recall, and which we will have to take up in its when we come to it. But if you have an edge, you must have something that, you must have a surface which ends because of the incursion of another surface, or simply the end of the surface by, the ending of the surface by some other medium. And when you have this kind of remarkable thing happening at the moment of death, you wonder about the man's you wonder about the man's metaphysics, and you wonder about what his concerns are about about what happens after a man dies. In other words, what I'm saying is that if we have a terrible attention, we have a great deal of attention drawn to the moment of death, we must think of not only the time before death, but the time after death in some way or another. We go on then with Kurtz taking off his shoe and throwing it into the water. He has in a way shared in the death of the helmsman by having his shoe filled with the blood of the man, and we shall see after a short time the problem of the helmsman and what the helmsman means to Kurtz.
Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Discussing this novel are Professor Alfred Marks and Professor Joseph Satterwhite.
Now, right in the middle of the burial of the helmsman, the act of throwing him into the river, Marlowe's mind abruptly switches from the helmsman to Kurtz. Some readers may be somewhat upset by the apparent lack of logical time sequence in the novel. I'd like to point out that Marlowe's reminiscences are organized by what I'd call the logic of association. As he throws his blood-filled shoe over the side of the boat, a pilgrim murmurs, no doubt he is dead. That is, no doubt Kurtz is dead already. And this mention of Kurtz's name sends Marlowe's mind into some speculation about Kurtz and the opportunities that he may have lost to talk with Kurtz. We have a 5 or 6 page interval here in which the helmsman is forgotten and Kurtz is an important character.
In one description of Kurtz, he talks about Kurtz's discussion with Marlowe later on in the book, and he refers to the disinterred body of Mr. Kurtz saying, "my intended." There is almost the implication that Kurtz has been dead and has come alive again, almost like a kind of trip into hell on the part of Kurtz taken here into the wilderness. And then he describes Kurtz with the words, referring to the bald head of Kurtz, reminding us perhaps that Yul Brynner would be the obvious man to play a Kurtz in a modern Heart of Darkness. "The wilderness had patted him on the head, and behold, it was like a ball, an ivory ball." The word ivory is quite admired. "It had caressed him, and lo, he had withered. It had taken him, loved him, embraced him, got into his veins, consumed his flesh, and sealed his soul to its own by the inconceivable ceremonies of some devilish initiation." And there is even the woman, of course, the native woman brought in here, showing that this statement is not only figurative, but that it states an actual thing taking place, a kind of symbolism of this action of the wilderness on Kurtz.
Of course, Marlowe here foreshadows a great many of the events that will later take place. He talks in an enigmatic fashion about Kurtz's fiancée back in Europe, how he had to lie to her. He intimates that Kurtz has succumbed to the heart of darkness and has become savage. All in all, it gives Marlowe an opportunity as a good storyteller to intrigue us with hints and foreshadowings as to what is to happen when Kurtz and Marlowe meet. Al, I'm interested here in the lines that follow the line you quoted. "The same to know what he belonged to, how many powers of darkness claimed him for their own." There then follows what seems to me to be about the finest statement we'll find of Conrad or Marlowe's statement about how one evades the heart of darkness. Do you think it'd be worth our while to take a look at the next 10 or 15 lines?
Well, I think it does bring up an important problem, yes.
For example, Marlowe tries to impress upon his listeners that they aren't really qualified to understand the temptations that he, Marlowe, and Kurtz undergo. How could you, he said, with solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you at a fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman, and the holy terror of scandal and gallows and lunatic asylums, how can you imagine what particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him into by way of solitude? Utter solitude without a policeman, by the way of silence, utter silence where no warning voice of a kind neighbor can be heard whispering of public opinion. These, of course, are the things that keep a man straight. Police action, public opinion, all of the threatening and punitive forces that take reprisal if one violates the civilized conventions. And of course, none of these apply in the jungle.
And then he says, when they are gone, you must fall back upon your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. And this is the one evanescent quality that the savages, that the cannibals possess. This restraint that comes into bearing when all of these things that a European might lose here in the jungle, and they have never gotten, are no longer preventing them from a given action.
Well, I think we may safely say that Kurt's mistake was in assuming that he had more innate strength than he had. And Conrad is constantly showing us the picture of the idealist who actually doesn't know who he is, has no idea of his own innate strength, and rushes, therefore, ill-advisedly into a condition that destroys him. This, it seems to me, is the state of Lord Jim and of others we might mention in Conradian fiction.
Yes, then he talks about the kind of men who come under his purview here. Of course, he says, you may be too much of a fool to go wrong, too dull even to know you are being assaulted by the powers of darkness. And
of course, this is the same sort of fellow that Hemingway talks about, and the same sort of fellow who appears in Melville. The man who simply is unaware of his own capacity for evil, and also unaware of the force the world exerts upon him. He's the unaware man.
Yes, but actually I think he sets up two kinds of unaware men, doesn't he? He says, or you may be such a thunderingly exalted creature as to be altogether deaf and blind to anything but heavenly sights and sounds. And then he says, most of us are neither one nor the other. We are neither the fool nor the angel.
Mm-hmm. And we must put up with sights, with sounds, with smells, breathe dead hippo, so to speak, and not be contaminated. Now, for these people, firm principles are necessary. The devotion to work or other devotions equally strong.
Yes, and it's based on this that I think of Marlowe as making this trip up here exposed to the incursions of all kinds of temptations, and, if you will, temptations toward atavism, temptations to regress to some much earlier period of time in man's existence.
It's this temptation, of course, that Marlowe acknowledges when he turns to his auditors and say, do you wonder that I didn't get out of the boat and dance and grunt? And then he points out that he was just too busy for any regression of this sort.
And Marlowe then says, and there, don't you see, your strength comes in, the faith in your ability for the digging of unostentatious holes to bury the stuff in, your power of devotion, not to yourself, but to an obscure, back-breaking business. As to what this obscure, back-breaking business is, it's hard to say, but it certainly seems to do with morality and with the necessity of keeping oneself morally straight, in the words of the Boy Scout law.
Al, at the risk of getting into serious trouble, I'd suggest that at least in this context, morality is not really involved. Your power of devotion, not to yourself, but to an obscure, back-breaking business. It seems to me that what Marlowe is saying, that any sort of selfless devotion to any sort of operation or any sort of principle, moral or amoral or immoral, will satisfactorily protect yourself. I seem to sense that that had the Pilgrims gone in a selfless manner about the exploitation of the Dark Continent, if they had devoted themselves wholeheartedly to their work, they too would have been protected against the heart of darkness. That Kurtz goes wrong, if I may anticipate, not in the manner by which he secures ivory, but in his excursion into native theology when he sets himself up as a god before the natives.
Well, I don't know that I would agree that Conrad feels that a man who is completely diabolical in his devotion to a diabolical cause, who moves without detour toward some reprehensible objective, is a worthy man in Conrad's way of looking at it. In fact,
of course,
the manager
you distorted my argument by saying a diabolical man. I'm simply saying that individual personal integrity can exist while the individual is devoted to a reprehensible objective. Or so it seems to me.
Yes, now, this is very important, the problem of what kind of morality there is in Conrad, and whether there is only the problem of devotion to a cause, whatever its content, or whether there is a definite statement that the devotion must be to something worthwhile.
Let's look at it in the context of the novel. Here Marlowe, a man who, it seems to me, maintains his integrity, maintains his inner faithfulness, is nevertheless the employee of a rapacious organization whose principal excuse for existing is to ravish the Dark Continent. Now, although he works for an organization which ravages the Dark Continent, he himself, that is, the individual Marlowe, can maintain his own integrity, and by his devotion to his work, save himself from the sort of depravity, the sort of evil that Kurtz subsequently falls into.
Well, Marlowe definitely feels superior to this organization, this rapacious organization which is single-mindedly bleeding this continent. He feels superior to the man of work back there with his figures, the man with his starched cuffs and collars out at the landing.
You know, Al, it doesn't seem to me he feels superior to that fellow, the accountant, the man who dresses impeccably in the jungle and the man who devotes himself to his accounts. My impression, and of course it's just an impression, is that here is one of the heroic figures in the novel.
And I think that, I'm not sure whether you choose to support this or not, I'm certain that he feels superior to the manager.
Oh, I agree.
And perhaps, on the one hand, this is what keeps the manager alive, that he is single-mindedly rapacious. Maybe this is what keeps him going, and whereas it doesn't do it for Kurtz.
Precisely.
Now then, I would say that simply saving one's skin is not the important thing for Conrad, but there is something that one strives for above the simple business of keeping alive, of steering one's way up the river without hitting any snags.
Now, I didn't say that, I used the word personal integrity. I didn't say simply staying alive. I meant the refusal to undergo a personal deterioration. You referred to the accountant. Let me quote some lines. In the great demoralization of the land, he kept up his appearance. That's backbone. This man had verily accomplished something. He was devoted to his books, which were in apple pie order. It seems to me that Marlowe has great admiration for the accountant, the one center of sanity and integrity in the vast chaos of demoralized men, which is the outer station.
But I think there is something strange in the fact that eventually perhaps he has more respect for Kurtz, who had a trace of idealism along with the desire to do a job well, who also, as you mentioned, made an excursion into an area that was not necessarily that which he was primarily concerned with, and who perhaps became a kind of damned soul. He seems to prefer Kurtz I think, to anybody whom he meets in the book.
Well, okay, we'll wait for evidence to support this view. Would you
Then
go ahead?
he
Al?
goes on to discussing Kurtz, and he says of Kurtz, all Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz a kind of universal figure, at least a universal European. And then he gives us some words in advance about the way in which he presided at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which, as far as I reluctantly gathered from what I heard at various times, were offered up to him, to Mr. Kurtz himself. In other words, he becomes a kind of white god in the jungle here. And then he is talking about Kurtz's document, his report to the Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. And he says, he began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them savages in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the Midas of deity, and so on and so on. And then along the way you have this strange little word that comes in here like a flash of lightning in a serene sky: exterminate all the brutes.
Of course, this is the postscript to an essay that Kurtz had been commissioned to write, been commissioned by the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. This is our first hint of Kurtz's idealism. He'd gone into the jungle apparently with the subsidiary purpose of reforming and civilizing the savages, and after he writes his report, which was a beautiful piece of writing according to Marlowe, he adds, exterminate all the brutes. Apparently, Kurtz comes to see that these savages, no matter what their inexplicable restraints may be, are essentially brutes. It seems to me this line sums up for us everything that Kurtz learns in the jungle, not only about himself, but about human nature as well.
Well, I don't know that it does, really. I mean, I think that in the book, what Marlowe learns is much more important to us than what Kurtz learns, because Kurtz is, by nature, a rather imperfect witness. He is too much involved, and he doesn't really recognize what he has learned until just before he dies, whereas Marlowe is learning these things all the time and never does really lose his restraint, as Kurtz did.
Incidentally, in reference to your remark about Marlowe's regard for Kurtz, in the next paragraph here, we get back to the helmsman, who's been lying unburied all this time. And Marlowe says, I can't forget him, Kurtz, though I am not prepared to affirm that the fellow, that is Kurtz, was exactly worth the life we lost in getting to him. I missed my late helmsman awfully. And this, of course, serves a dual purpose. It gives us some idea of what Marlowe thinks of Kurtz, and it also gets us back to the dead helmsman who has been lying in his own gore while Marlowe thinks about Kurtz.
I think we notice something strange here in the juxtaposition here. Dr. Satterwhite, I hate to bring up a technique that you've used several times here, but that is one of sticking very close to the context.
The idea of irony.
He mentions Marlowe and says, he mentions Kurtz, and it says of him, he had the power to charm or frighten rudimentary souls into an aggravated witch dance in his honor. He could also fill the small souls of the pilgrims with bitter misgivings. He had one devoted friend at least, and he had conquered one soul in the world that was neither rudimentary nor tainted with self-seeking. We are not told who this person is. We don't know whether it is Marlowe or whether it is the Russian. We are just not told who this person is.
Have you exhausted the alternatives? Who in the novel is most devoted to Kurtz? Who could be described as neither rudimentary nor tainted with self-seeking?
I would think of it as being Marlowe, but I just don't know.
Could it not also be possibly his intended? This young lady who suffers none of the doubts about Kurtz?
Perhaps so, but I would say of her that she was rudimentary.
We simply don't have any evidence as to her mental stature.
And that's what I can't work out, and so that's why I'm interested in the fact that immediately after this statement he says, no, I can't forget him, though I'm not prepared to affirm the fellow was exactly worth the life we lost in getting to him. There is a strange juxtaposition here that makes it seem as if it is Marlowe and yet it isn't, and I don't think Conrad tells us, because I don't think he wants us to I don't think he wants to tell us. He wants us to try to figure it out and take up the alternatives as we did. And then he says, I missed my late helmsman awfully. This is the next word. Why does he say this? And then he says, I missed him even while his body was still lying in the pilot house. And I find, and maybe this is something I can't explain, but I find when he mentions the body still lying in the pilot house, I think of Christ in the tomb. And I begin to wonder here if, in a way, the helmsman, in his death here, does not symbolize the kind of Christian restraint, the kind of Christian principles that Marlowe is shedding, is losing, as he moves further into the jungle, as he loses more and more of his principles, and must finally come to depend on his own resources and his own central strength.
With remarkable restraint, I'll raise just one question. Have we been prepared for any shedding of Christian principles? I haven't been impressed with the fact that Marlowe lives by Christian principles at any time. Seems to me he is a man who is a student of human nature, is well aware of the temptations that come to human beings. His varied discussions on how to avoid the plight of Kurtz, and incidentally the plight of the helmsman, it seemed to me, are always of this world rather than of the other world. He never employs supernatural sanctions, it seems to me. Never makes a remark which I can interpret as Christian.
Well, we've already referred to our basic disagreement, and we'll come more to it as to the last words of Kurtz. I wonder here about this business of the helmsman who is steering here and who had steered for him, and when he lifts him, he remembers his receiving his wound, and he talks about the intimate profundity of that look he gave me when he received his hurt remains to this day in my memory, like a claim of distant kinship affirmed in a supreme moment. Then we think of the altercation and the burying here of the helmsman. We don't have to take these last words as being a kind of burial of Christ, as I say there might be an implication of. He says of the man as he buries him, poor fool, if he had only left that shutter alone, he had no restraint, just like Kurtz, a tree swayed by the wind. And then as he buries him, he says, oh, he was heavy, heavier than any man on earth I should imagine. And I think that this represents, on the one hand, perhaps a rather blatant statement of symbolism of the white man's burden, and I think it also represents a strong sense of guilt on Kurtz's part, or Marlowe's part, and a sense of somehow sharing in the death of the helmsman, somehow understanding the death of the helmsman in the kinship that they have for each other. Then he buries the helmsman in the water, and of course nobody seems to agree with this statement, with this action. The pilgrims are scandalized, and of course the so-called woodcutters, the cannibals, are also scandalized. They'd like to eat him. And Kurtz says that he does this just because his body here would have been a first-class temptation. But I think it's also important to understand that Marlowe really does not want this helmsman consumed in any undignified way. That somehow he has a respect for the man in death. Then they come to the station. There's a great deal of excitement about the station, and when they look at the station, he noticed that there is no enclosure of any kind, but there had been one apparently, for near the house half a dozen slim posts remained in a row, roughly trimmed, and with their upper ends ornamented with round carved balls. And after a time we shall discover that these balls are actually skulls standing here on the posts, representing the complete depravity of Kurtz.
Then as the steamship draws near the station, which Kurtz directs, a very interesting figure comes running down to the edge of the river. He's in a coat of motley, a coat of patches of all sorts of colors, and this young man turns out to be the owner of the book on navigation, which was discovered earlier down the river. I find this man very interesting, this young man. He's 25 years of age, the son of a Russian priest. He remains nameless, it's interesting to note. But he's a type of figure who appears pretty frequently in Conrad's fiction, the incurable romantic, the unaware man who moves amongst temptations and dangers and is protected from them by his own innocence, his own unawareness. Now, he's been taking care of Kurtz because Kurtz has been ill. Kurtz has threatened to shoot him. The natives represent a constant threat to him, and he moves through all these threats unscathed. Al, do you have any ideas on this young man?
I think the dress of the man is important. The patches on the back, patches on the front, blue, red, yellow, scarlet edging at the bottom of his trousers. This we might say motley appearance, although the word motley, we understand, has been shown by Leslie Hodson to mean not at all a patchwork of colors, but to be a kind of gray color in Shakespeare. Nevertheless, using the word motley as we sometimes think of it to be, he has a number of different colors, and he's called, at one point here, a harlequin, quite specifically. And I think this is to emphasize the way in which the man is a kind of fool in his innocence.
Yes. At the beginning of chapter 3, Marlowe more specifically defines him. Let me read a few lines. The glamour of youth enveloped his party-colored rags, his destitution, his loneliness, the essential desolation of his futile wandering. For months, for years, his life hadn't been worth a day's purchase. And there he was, gallantly, thoughtlessly alive, to all appearance indestructible solely by the virtue of his few years and of his unreflecting audacity.
I think it is important, however, that this young man has had a strong church background, in spite of the fact that he isn't utilizing this here. I may be laboring too much my point that whether Conrad mentions Christian theology specifically or not, he very often has it working in the background, almost uncalled upon, nevertheless present. Recall how this happens in his novel Victory, how in Victory we have a kind of reproduction of the Adam and Eve interlude, where the lovers go off to an island by themselves to attempt to live in a paradise that knows no God, or at least knows, or that is above evil. The motley, the figure in motley, however, I think is Conrad's figure of youth. He is obsessed by the idea of youth and what happens to youth, and don't you think that this is a reason for his using the Russian in this way? That he is the youth running into something that he has no recognition of, and quite unaware of all the difficulties that he is in because of his wide-eyed interest in the newness of the whole affair.
Seems to me he's the perennial innocent who pops up in so much other fiction. In Melville, for example. He's Captain Delano in Melville's Benito Cereno, for example. His very unawareness protects him.
But he has more that a youth has. He says, Conrad does, if the absolutely pure, uncalculating, unpractical spirit of adventure had ever ruled a human being, it ruled this bepatched youth. I almost envied him the possession of this modest and clear flame, the spirit of adventure, which conditions his innocence. There is almost, with the youth, almost an implication of homosexuality, too. I think, where the youth mentions to Marlowe, the night did not seem to last an hour. Everything he and Kurtz talked about. Of love, too. And says Marlowe, he talked to you of love, I said, much amused. It isn't what you think, he cried, almost passionately. It was in general. He made me see things. And so we can say that, of course, it was platonic love that they were talking about. And a little later we will see that the woman, the native woman whom Kurtz was consorting with, wants this young man removed from the scene. And we wonder there again of the problem of jealousy, and we wonder again whether Conrad is just giving a hint which we can pass by and reject, that homosexuality might have been added to the number of other of Kurtz's vices here in the jungle.
Well, let me ask you this, Al. If we assume that a writer is always a highly self-conscious, calculating, deliberate sort of creator, and that everything he puts into his novel is functional, let me ask this. What purpose would be served in suggesting that the young Russian and Kurtz are lovers, in suggesting the hint, and I certainly agree with you, it's here, that there is a note of homosexual attraction here. What served? What purpose?
We must first look at it and say, what purpose could be served by bringing it up deliberately and definitely and denotatively? This would simply emphasize the great depravity of Kurtz here in the jungle. However, to bring it up in that way might have been too blatant for the readers of Conrad, and perhaps also have hurt Conrad's own sensibilities. So he brings it up only as a hint, and lets us work out the rest.
Of course, it's perfectly acceptable on the realistic level. I think Conrad had enough experience at sea to know that men isolated and confined largely to male company may develop homosexual tendencies. On the other hand, Kurtz as a homosexual would be an almost gratuitous depravity, because he does have female companionship, as we'll later discover. Seems to me this makes it doubly important of a hint. A gratuitous depravity, almost as it were.
Yes, I think the hint, however, should be looked at as we move along. Then, as the young man talks, Marlowe says, I looked around, and I don't know why, but I assure you that never before did this land, this river, this jungle, the very arch of this blazing sky appear to me so hopeless and so dark, so impenetrable to human thought, so pitiless to human weakness. And somehow we see that the darkness of the jungle is being conditioned by the darkness of the outlook of the man who is witnessing it. And I think that this is important to see in thinking of the term heart of darkness, that darkness does not only refer to the intrinsic morality or lack of morality of the jungle. We then see, after a few pages, when Marlowe looks directly at the house, that the balls on the posts are heads. There is an interesting point to notice here in connection with these heads, that he is able to look at a number of them, but of that number, only one of them is turned toward the boat. The others are turned toward the house. And this is an interesting point, and could make a person get all involved, I believe, with symbolic interest here, but I think that the reason for it is rather simple. That it was necessary for him to turn one head around so that Marlowe could recognize it from the boat as being a head. He had to see the face of it. But it is nevertheless important symbolically to have the heads facing the house, so that they would be, in a way, looking up to Mr. Kurtz, who was in here.
At any rate, Marlowe's suspicions are confirmed. He speaks of the heads. They only show that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts. that there was something wanting in him, some small matter which, when the pressing need arose, could not be found under his magnificent eloquence. Whether he knew of this deficiency himself, I can't say. I think the knowledge came to him at last, only at the very last. But the wilderness had found him out early and taken on him a terrible vengeance for the fantastic invasion. The fantastic invasion, of course, is the invasion undertaken by a man who simply doesn't have the inner strength to withstand the temptations toward depravity.
Yes. Then he says of the scene of the heads drying on the stakes, "After all, that was only a savage sight, while I seemed at one bound to have been transported into some lightless region of subtle horrors, where pure, uncomplicated savagery was a positive relief, being something that had a right to exist, obviously, in the sunshine." And this emphasizes, then, that how far Marlowe has come, and it emphasizes the enormity of the things that have happened, that happen here in the heart of darkness, and emphasize it's a wonderful symbolism to give us an ability to see this as being a place of greater depravity than anything we have come to so far. Later, we see that he talks to Mr. Kurtz about this, and Mr. Kurtz said, "I had no idea of the conditions." He said, "These heads were the heads of rebels." Rebels? Of course, what were they rebelling against? We heard about rebels earlier, the men who were chained earlier. And all of this reminds me again of Twain's "To One Who Is Sitting in Darkness." It makes me wonder again whether that document is important here, because Twain was very upset by our calling referring to the difficulty that we had in the Philippines as the Philippine insurrection. Who were the Philippines insurrecting against? Who were they rebels against? And obviously they were rebels against the United States in some way or other. It's like our talking about Hungarian rebels executed by the Russians. Then he discusses Kurtz and gives him some compensation. He says of him he was shamefully abandoned. And of course this was the manager's work. He was, in a very strong sense, abandoned here. The manager sent no one to him, simply took his ivory and hoped that Kurtz would wear down. And this may emphasize the reason that the Central Station is so inept. The manager does not want to do anything with the Central Station. He does not want anything to happen there, because if it did, it would profit Kurtz, and eventually Kurtz would take over in the manager's place.
Of course, all the way through the novel, there's a hierarchy of depravity. When the manager speaks and accuses Kurtz of having unsound methods of collecting ivory and observes that he'll have to make a report showing a complete want of judgment in Kurtz, then Marlowe says to himself, "It seemed to me I had never breathed an atmosphere so vile, and I turned mentally to Kurtz for relief," positively for relief. There is this curiously ambiguous and ambivalent attitude toward Kurtz that we must investigate. There's something admirable, there's something horribly depraved in Kurtz. He is, for Marlowe, a curiously mixed figure.
Yes, and we shall come to this shortly. First, we notice the darkness come down over the house and over the symbolic row of stakes, and Conrad describes this with the words, "All this was in gloom, while we down there were yet in the sunshine," showing again the darkness coming over the building and over Kurtz's home, and yet the ship remains in sunshine, showing again the heart of darkness with the darkness coming over it. Then Kurtz is referred to a little further with the words, Kurtz. That means short in German, don't it? Well, the name was as true as everything else in his life and death. He looked at least 7 feet long. There is this ironic characteristic in the man that makes him something completely different from what he might otherwise seem to be. Then he sees the woman come out after Kurtz is brought up close to the boat, was being carried in the stretcher. The woman comes out, and she is a wild and gorgeous apparition of a woman, and we wonder if she is the original of the woman in the picture later on. And then she is described, and in the hush that had fallen suddenly upon the whole sorrowful land, the immense wilderness, the colossal body of the fecund and mysterious life seemed to look at her, pensive, as though it had been looking at the image of its own tenebrous and passionate soul. And so the woman is made out very clearly to be the symbol of the wilderness. Then when she lifts her hands, she opened her bared arms and threw them up rigid above her head as though in an uncontrollable desire to touch the sky. And at the same time the swift shadows darted out on the earth, swept around on the river, gathering the steamer into a shadowy embrace. And with her arms she almost conjures the darkness to come down about the ship. Then she talked like a fury to Kurtz for an hour. This is the reference to the way in which she tried to have the man in motley, the Russian, thrown out. She talked like a fury to Kurtz for an hour, pointing at me now and then. We wonder, of course, whether this is simply jealousy, or we wonder whether we are involved here in an allegorical struggle between the primeval and the modern, taking place perhaps even in Kurtz's own mind. That the two of them argue. There is the young man, the son of the priest, fighting for the soul of Kurtz, the modern man, and on the other hand there is the primeval forest fighting for him.
Al, I can't really go with the theory that the young Russian represents Christian view of things. We're told that the boy ran away while he was in school, and has since never returned home. His struggle with the native woman for Kurtz may represent something, but it seems to me that it probably doesn't represent any struggle between the secular or the primitive and the Christian. Perhaps between the primitive and the modern. Just a small point.
Yes. Well, there's an interesting symbolism too in the Russian, who is a seaman, and we may see that the manager is the modern man, but he is a landsman.
Actually, is the Russian a seaman, or does his study of Tolstoy's book on seamanship simply become one of those inexplicable methods by which he protects himself from the world?
Yes.
Is he a seaman?
I'm wondering too if it doesn't, however, emphasize that he is in a sense a seaman, as we are all seamen. And if the Tolstoy book doesn't represent for Conrad how the man who follows the sea has a good chance of being a better man than he who follows the land.
But this young man hasn't followed the sea except vicariously. It seems to me that his study of a book on navigation is as great an enigma as the inexplicable restraint of the cannibals who did not eat the pilgrims on the steamboat.
Yes, I am only associating the boat with book with him, and I'm saying that some of the symbolic character of the book rubs off on him, and it is true that we last see him disappearing in a boat, too, and in a small boat, which is a symbol in Conrad's youth of the way in which a young man must get along on his own bodily resources.
Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Discussing this novel are Professor Alfred Marks and Professor Joseph Satterwhite.
We move then to a discussion between the young man in motley, to the Russian, and Marlowe. After Marlowe has turned to the wilderness in relief to get away from the atmosphere so vile that is thrown up around him by the completely cynical, the
completely evil manager. And the Russian says to him something about Kurtz's being, or Marlowe's being, a brother seaman to whom he can't conceal knowledge of matters that would affect Mr. Kurtz's reputation. And again he repeats, I don't want any harm to happen to these whites here, but of course I was thinking of Mr. Kurtz's reputation. But you are a brother seaman, and all right, said I after a time, Mr. Kurtz's reputation is safe with me. And then he makes it clear that the attack that had been made on the boat had been ordered by Kurtz. Kurtz did not want these people to come to take him away. Perhaps I would be going too far by thinking here that this then is evidence too that Kurtz killed the helmsman of Marlowe, and that Kurtz is in a way symbolically guilty here of bringing about a regression from high morality on the part of Marlowe.
Aren't we pretty well shown, Al, that Kurtz is incapacitated? He's brought onto the steamship on a steamer. He later tries to escape in what for me is the most dramatic and climactic scene of the novel, and he has to get along by crawling. I think it highly unlikely, though I should like to think that Kurtz threw the spear that killed the helmsman. Nevertheless, other evidence seems to indicate that he incapacitated for this sort of thing.
He only threw the switch.
Yes.
Not the
Yes, that's perfectly
spear.
good. Now, Al, we come to a scene that, for me, as I've said, is the most dramatic of the novel. After Kurtz is brought aboard the steamboat, during the night that must pass before the return trip down the river is commenced, Marlowe, who is one of those sleepless men, awakes to find Kurtz attempting painfully by crawling to rejoin the natives whom he dominates and for whom he's something of a god. And we have a wonderful scene here in which the struggle which you have already described seems to me to take place. The struggle between the temptation to atavism, to regression, which Kurtz experiences, and the restraint which Marlowe attempts to apply. Would you care to discuss this scene?
I'm interested only in a few words here, and that is the words, he is crawling on all fours.
Yes.
And I recall the statement made by Voltaire in connection with Rousseau, in which Voltaire said, he makes me want to get down on all fours. The same symbolism is used in Hawthorne's story, The Maypole of Merrymount, in which he tells how the people of Merrymount dance with a bear. And he says how the bear rose on his hind feet to take the hands of his companions as they stooped. And so I think there is a symbolism here of atavism on the part of Kurtz.
Yes, a particularly happy example. Marlowe and Kurtz struggle here as Kurtz tries to crawl nearer to the campfire of the savages, and Marlowe tells him, if you go, you will be lost, utterly lost. And then Marlowe describes the scene in unmistakably unambiguous language. I tried, he said, to break the spell, the heavy, mute spell of the wilderness that seemed to draw him to its pitiless breast by the awakening of forgotten and brutal instincts, by the memory of gratified and monstrous passions. And Marlowe wins the struggle, largely because he's the stronger of the two. And after threatening to kill Kurtz if Kurtz cries out, the two return to the steamship.
And there are here words, though, that make me feel more that I want to mention in connection with the ethic lurking here, that if it's not a Christian ethic, it is at least an ethic that is based on Christianity or similar to Christianity. He says of him, of Kurtz, there was nothing either above or below him, and I knew it. He had kicked himself loose of the earth. As to whether the above and below means heaven or hell, or heaven and hell, it's hard to say, but he does say after just a few lines, soul, if anybody had ever struggled with a soul, I am the man. And then he says, I saw the inconceivable mystery of a soul that knew no restraint, no faith, and no fear, yet struggling blindly with itself. And I think this is very similar to the notion of restraint that we've seen here before, that somehow there is this quality brought to play in Kurtz. And so he helps him away, he helps him back, and he said, my legs shook under me as though I had carried half a ton on my back down that hill. Again, there is the sense of supporting as there is when he carries the helmsman and buries him.
Exactly, and it seems to me this time we have a more narrow definition. The great weight, I think, is the weight of self-knowledge. Marlowe says, being alone in the wilderness, it, that is, Kurt's soul, had looked within itself, and by heavens, I tell you, had gone mad. And I had, for my sins, I suppose, to go through the ordeal of looking into it myself. The great weight, it seems to me, is the weight of being forced to identify oneself with both the helmsman and Kurtz. That is, self-discovery, the discovery that one is capable of the same lack of restraint, the same descent into atavistic depravity.
Yes, and I wonder if also there's also the sense of responsibility here. Very great responsibility for the person whom he is rescuing. A definite sense of scrambling somehow to shore out of the depths that they have been, for a time, cast into.
Well, I think the idea of responsibility, joint responsibility, is a dominant motif in Conrad. He constantly talks about these little clusters of responsible men who represent the isolated centers of life in a world of darkness. The island motif, the village motif, the village surrounded by the jungle, these become symbols in Marlowe, it seems to me, of security and safety. And of course, the security depends to a large extent on the integrity of all the individuals who make up such a community.
They then carry Kurtz into the boat while the savages repeat some kind of satanic litany outside the ship. And he begins the paragraph by saying, we had carried Kurtz into the pilot house. And of course, knowing me, you know that I'm wondering again about the symbolism of the pilot house. And I'm wondering if we do not have the symbolism that, again, Kurtz is in good hands, and that Kurtz is somehow placed within a realm that can exert some kind of assistance to him in maintaining control over himself as a civilized man, and perhaps as a regenerate man, even though a damned one at this point, if you'll excuse me using those two terms in such close juxtaposition. Then, as they leave the place, we have the picture of the barbarous and superb woman who did not so much as flinch and stretched tragically her bare arms after us over the somber and glittering river. This final symbol here as they leave, almost like the Statue of Liberty in reverse. Then they move down the current of the river, and we're told that Kurtz's life was running swiftly to ebbing, making clear again perhaps the symbolism of what the river is here.
But most importantly, those conversations that Marlowe has looked forward to with such great anticipation finally do occur. Kurtz discoursed. A voice, says Marlowe, a voice. It rang deep to the very last. And we have then the exchange of ideas between the two, which reveals to us Kurtz's own sense of his depravity and gives us Marlowe's commentary on that.
We have an interesting sentence along the way there in which he says that from the weary brain of Kurtz come images of wealth and fame revolving obsequiously around his unextinguishable gift of noble and lofty expression. The two things, the loftiness, the idealism, and at the same time the images of wealth and fame.
Kurtz dies there in the pilot house in the presence of Marlowe. And I'd like to skip now a page or two till we come to the last words which Kurtz utters. The last words which he utters in the presence of Marlowe, he breathes these words, the horror. And then a little bit later, one of the crewmen puts his head into the mess hall and announces, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. And from this point on, what we have is Marlowe's speculation about what Kurtz had meant when he says the horror.
Along the way there, I'm interested in the statement made by Kurtz in connection with motives. He says, of course, you must take care of the motives, right motives, always, almost making it seem as if the ends justify the means. He's concerned about the motives, meaning the ends, and not so much the means itself. And then the symbolism when, with the words when Kurtz says, I am lying here in the dark waiting for death, and Marlowe says, the light was within a foot of his eyes. We see then the symbolism here that he is in darkness. Then, before he dies, he says, it was as though a veil had been rent. I saw in that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? So there is this notion as to what takes place in a man who is about to die. He undergoes a supreme moment of complete knowledge. As to whether this is a knowledge of what happens after death, it's hard to say. It might be similar to what Emily Dickinson is talking about in the poem in which she says, my life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me, so large, so hopeless to conceive as those that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. All we know of heaven is this moment when a person is about to die. However, we must be careful about how far we carry what is happening in Kurtz's mind here in the moment before his death. Then he goes on to say, I went no more near the remarkable man who had pronounced the judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. The horror is a judgment on what has happened in the life of Kurtz. And then he speaks of life as being that mysterious arrangement of merciless logic for a futile purpose. The most you can hope from it is some knowledge of yourself that comes too late, a crop of unextinguishable regrets. This certainly underscores a good deal of what you have to say about this, Dr. Satterwhite. I know you're interested in it.
This is the very heart of Conrad. Perhaps I ride my critical horse until it drops beneath me, but it seems to me that most of Conrad's protagonists are men in search of self-knowledge. And that, in fact, Marlowe himself becomes an expert in a study of human nature and an indefatigable searcher for self-knowledge. It's a lack of self-knowledge that betrays the Conradian hero, it seems to me. A failure of self-knowledge.
But this is what interests him in connection with Kurtz. He says, this is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He said it. Right. Since I had peeped over the edge myself, I understand better the meaning of his stare, that could not see the flame of the candle, but was wide enough to embrace the whole universe, piercing enough to penetrate all the hearts that beat in the darkness. He had summed up, he had judged the horror. He was a remarkable man, and he is excited about Conrad because of the fact that he has, or rather about Kurtz, because he has somehow the ability to look at the world for what it is and to see himself for what he is.
Oh, precisely. This is what makes Kurtz an admirable figure. I'm fascinated by the metaphor to peep over the edge. Marlowe says, I had peeped over the edge myself. What makes Kurtz a memorable figure, and what attracts Marlowe is the fact that they both have shared, to a certain extent, this close, candid look at themselves. And I think it's this that Kurtz refers to when he speaks of the horror, because the human soul is a horrible repository of all sorts of potential depravities. And it's this, of course, this depravity that restraint guards us against.
And this represents something wonderfully remarkable to Conrad. As he says a little further down, he talks about how all the wisdom and all truth and all sincerity are just compressed into that inappreciable moment of time in which we step over the threshold of the invisible. Better his cry, much better. It was an affirmation of moral victory paid for by innumerable defeats. And he hears then not his own voice, but the echo of his magnificent eloquence thrown to me from a soul as translucently pure as a cliff of crystal, the victory of the human being over death and over all the difficulties of life itself. Then we have, in the end of it, a good many words summing up the problem of Kurtz. After several paragraphs, Conrad writes, he had faith, don't you see? He had the faith. And the word, the horror is mentioned quite a bit. It's interesting to notice that this is one of Henry James' favorite words, too. Then he comes to the beloved, to the intended of Kurtz. Marlowe sees her. And yes?
Earlier, Marlowe has agreed with the Russian that they'll together keep Kurtz's secret. At the time, Marlowe says he didn't know that he was fated to become the keeper of the secret. But this becomes very important. When he returns to the city, he has to keep off a horde of interested priors, people who'd like to get Kurt's documents and one thing and another. And Marlowe very carefully and very assiduously refuses to allow any documents to get out which would compromise the memory of Kurtz. And very particularly, he does nothing to disturb the young lady, Kurtz intended, nothing to disturb her memories of Kurtz as a young idealist. I wonder why, Al. Why is Marlowe so careful to maintain Kurt's reputation?
On the one hand, it's a pact that he has made with the young idealistic man who has given it to him on the word of a seaman. Mm-hmm. On the other, it's another one of these things that Marlowe has in him, another one of these restraints that he has to have this kind of loyalty even to a dead man, the same kind of loyalty perhaps that's mentioned in de la Mare's The Traveller, in which the traveller says, "Tell them I came and no one answered that I kept my word," he said. I don't know, was there anything else you were thinking of there?
Well, it just occurred to me that all the way through the novel we have Marlowe exclaiming over the difficulties of communication. At intervals throughout the story, he turns to his listeners and exclaims, "Of course you can't understand, you weren't there." This is the constant problem of the artist, to communicate what he feels so intensely. I wonder if part of Marlowe's silence isn't compelled by the knowledge that he can never communicate to those who don't know the heart of darkness the dreadful experience that Kurtz has gone through and the dreadful knowledge that he, Marlowe, has of human nature. It's simply a reticence that comes partially from the knowledge that it's impossible to communicate.
It would also be a way of Marlowe and Conrad behind him protecting their story and giving a reason for the fact that nobody else knows the story and has no other. I'm interested, however, in the words in connection with those documents in which he says, "Expect nothing else," I said. "There are only private letters," and then the man who wants the letters withdraws upon some threat of legal proceedings, and then another fellow, calling himself Kurtz's cousin, appears 2 days later and is anxious to hear all the details about his dear relative's last moments. Incidentally, he gave me to understand that Kurtz had been essentially a great musician, and all of this business comes up. And I'm reminded of the Aspirin Papers by Henry James, in which we have the same kind of attempt to get documents on a man who has died, and the intent seems to be to use the documents to, in a way, defame him. To go on with the meeting with the beloved,
You knew him best, I repeated, and perhaps she did, but with every word spoken the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and white, remained illumined by the unextinguishable light of belief and love. There's a wonderful irony here, that it's dark because they do not understand each other, and she cannot understand Kurtz, and the darkness symbolizes her stupidity, but the light symbolizes her unextinguishable light of belief and love. Quite ironic.
Well, hardly stupidity. Wouldn't it seems to me that innocence would be a better word. Here's a young lady who has never been made aware of capacity for evil that
Yes.
is in every human heart.
Then Marlowe says to her, "His words will remain," I said, and she says, "and his example." And of course his example is not being thought of in the same terms as she uses. "True," I said, "his example too." "Yes, his example. I forgot that." Then we have the symbolism here of the dark and light angels around him. "I saw him clearly enough then. I shall see this eloquent phantom as long as I live, and I shall see her too, a tragic and familiar shade, resembling in this gesture another one, tragic also, and bedecked with powerless charms, stretching bare brown arms over the glitter of the infernal stream, the stream of darkness." She said suddenly, very low, "He died as he lived." And Marlowe, still enigmatic, says, "His end," said I, with dull anger staring in me, "was in every way worthy of his life." We won't go on any more with that kind of discussion, but at the end he says, "I could not tell her. It would have been too dark altogether." In other words, let's keep a little light in this story anyway. And at the end of it, the offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. Now, what is this darkness, Dr. Satterwhite?
Well, as I have consistently maintained all along, perhaps ill-advisedly, the heart of darkness, it seems to me, is ultimately the human heart, which has an enormous, inexhaustible capacity for evil if restraint is missing. I think we ought also to point out that not every man is capable of the self-knowledge that comes to Kurtz and Marlowe. I'm reminded of Hemingway's short story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, in which one speaker says to another, there are some people who simply go through life without recognizing the capacity it has for harming us and the capacity we have for harming ourselves. Kurtz and Marlowe are both heroic, it seems to me, because they have come to self-knowledge. It seems to me that Heart of Darkness is just another of Conrad's novels in which the major motif is the search for self-knowledge, the search for complete and accurate knowledge of one's capacities to resist the world, in terms of which knowledge one can take care not to move into temptations which are beyond one's strength.
I'd like to then sum up what I might call the principal rays of light in the darkness of this novel. First, there is Kurtz's recognition, in your terms, Dr. Satterwhite, of his evil past and the damnation he has brought upon himself. Second, there is Kurtz's final affirmation, which is in connection with his self-knowledge. It had candor, it had conviction, it had a vibrating note of revolt in its whisper. Mm-hmm. Finally, there are certain elements important here of man's faith. That first brings light to the jungle, as Kurtz brought it to the savages and to the Russian, and second, the kind of faith that gives the girl a cherished memory of a man, even a man who is damned, which memory may be based upon her own vanity, but which memory may also be based on the way in which a soul can go out, not with a whimper, but with a bang.
Thanks for that reference to Mr. Eliot.